Chapter 253. The long-distance transmission and control of magic power requires a high level of control and quality of magic power. Therefore, under normal circumstances, we can only learn about this after the second year. However, there are some very outstanding people who can meet the requirements in just one semester. Professor Kazair raised his wand and pointed at the 6 students, including Dake, and then smiled. Today's lesson is mainly for them, but it's not just for them. It is good for everyone to be exposed to this knowledge as early as possible. Being proficient in controlling magic power will make it easier for you to learn in the future. Enough with the small talk. Now let's have one student cooperate with me to give a demonstration. Professor Kazair turned to look at the 6 students. His eyes swept across their faces one by one, and finally chose Dake, who was the most outstanding in terms of quality and control of magic power. Dimming, come here. Dake took 2 steps and came in front of Professor Kazair. Professor Kazair nodded with satisfaction and raised his wand. Come, stretch out your hand and gather magic power on your fingertips. Dake stretched out his right hand and gathered magic power on his index finger. This finger was still wearing the magic ring that Professor Kazair had given him. As the magic power gathered, a faint light appeared on the tip of his index finger. Professor Kazair stretched out his wand and pointed it at his fingertip. The wisp of magic power was drawn out and drew a thin arc of light in the air. Remember the URL, MVIP, can't you? 6. The students below the stage instantly quieted down. One by one, they stared at the thin line with their eyes wide open. The long-distance transmission and control of magic power is, in essence, a branch of the application of magic power materialization. Professor Kazair's voice was steady and steady. We release magic power and condense it into a thin line. Stretch, stretch, and stretch again. On the basis of ensuring that the magic power does not disperse, we stretch it to the limit. He began to move to the side. As he walked, he stretched the thread of magic power longer and longer. Gradually, it became so thin that it was difficult to see with the naked eye. If the quality of the magic power is insufficient, it will break during the process of elongation. He gently shook his wand, making the glowing transparent thread more conspicuous. Fortunately, the quality of Diming's mana is already quite good. Having said that, he suddenly let go of his wand and let it float in the air. Then he said to Dake, "Come, manipulate your magic and try to move this wand." Dake frowned slightly. The materialization of mana was actually a very difficult task. Regardless of whether they were archmages, mages, or alchemists, as long as they were magic professions, they should know that magic power was a substance that dissipated easily. The human body was the best carrier of magic power, followed by gold, mercury, and other substances. Once the mana was forced out of the body, it would quickly escape outwards. The light emitted from this phenomenon would allow people to recognize the invisible magic power. The stronger the light emitted by the magic power, the more magic power dissipated. Therefore, magic wands, magic pens, magic swords, and other tools were not simply an extension of the arm. In order to materialize mana, even if it was just a thread, it required good control of the mana, so that it would not dissipate too quickly outside the body. After Dake obtained the magic ring, he had tried this technique, but he was still unable to solve the problem of mana dissipation. This time, he was able to condense such a long thread and not dissipate it directly because of Professor Kazair's guidance. It seemed to be an understatement, but this guidance ability was actually very powerful. In comparison, manipulating the magic thread to move the wand was simply too easy. He did not even think about how to do it. He just wanted to do it. The wand spun in the air a few times, nimbly and freely. "Oh!" Professor Kazair shouted very exaggeratedly, then reached out to grab the handle of the wand and said, "Dimming did very well. I now regret letting him do the first demonstration, because it is easy to make you think that using mana to move the wand is a very simple thing, but in fact it is very difficult. Doran, you are the second one." Doran. This kind of statement made it clear that he wanted to use him as a negative example, which made Doran completely unhappy. He secretly swore to himself that he would not be worse than Dake. In the end, after Professor Kazair helped him to stretch the magic into a relatively short thread, He tried to move the wand by his own will. He suddenly threw the wand towards the ceiling. The thread of magic power broke and disappeared on the spot. There was a burst of restrained laughter from the audience. Doran's face turned slightly red. Professor Kazair reached out and called the wand back into his hand, but nodded with satisfaction. A very good demonstration. Doran's face suddenly darkened. Several people on the stage could not help but laugh. Professor Kazair then began to talk about how to control the magic power to move objects, as well as how to make the magic power condense and not disperse, and from time to time, he would ask someone to assist in the teaching. Dake listened very carefully, but after the first demonstration, he sat on the bench. The reason was that it was too perfect, so it could not be used as a proper demonstration. In contrast, Doran, who was lacking in talent and magic power, became the favored child. Of course, besides them, the other students were also called out. Under the guidance of Professor Kazair, pulling the magic power into a thread was a very valuable experience. As the saying goes, if there is a first, there will be a second. Humans were very good at imitating and learning creatures. After the first time, the second time would be easier. Simply reading books and self-learning would not have such an effect. Half an hour later, the 6 students were a little tired of standing on the podium, and Professor Kazair gave each of them a magic ball the size of a ping-pong ball. The core technique of using magic power to move a wand was actually to use one's own magic power to interfere with the magic power of the wand itself. Because the wand itself contained magic power, it was easy to move. This magic ball used to assist in teaching was also based on the same principle. Professor Kazair said with a smile, "Try to use your own strength to make the magic ball in your hands move." Under the gaze of dozens of eyes, the 6 students tried to use their own strength. Without the guidance of Professor Kazair, it was very difficult to condense the magic power into a thread after releasing it. In addition to the requirement of the ability to control magic power, there were also requirements of the strength of the individual's spiritual power. Dake, who had practiced the god of underworld magic, had a higher level of spiritual power than ordinary people. The bloodline of the demon god also gave him good talent in magic power. Therefore, it only took him 2 minutes to successfully turn the magic ball into a yo-yo, which attracted a lot of exclamations. Deanna, who was next to him, looked at this scene with envy. But if envy was useful, then everyone would have become a god long ago. Deanna gritted her teeth and immersed herself in the practice. The clumsy bird flies first, and hard work makes up for stupidity. These were all praises. On the side, Doran didn't want to fall behind and threw the magic ball into the air. Then he spread his fingers, interlocked his middle finger and thumb, and aimed at the magic ball and flicked it, as if he wanted to flick the thread of magic power from his fingers and catch the magic ball. This action was cool, but unfortunately it was useless. The magic ball fell to the ground with a thud. Group 1 of the Academy of Knights. Aima held the magic ball in his hand and kept thinking. Justin and Victor, on the other hand, believed in practice. White held the magic ball and watched Dake manipulate it flexibly. He felt like he had a lemon in his heart. He wasn't like this before, but after seeing the intimate interaction between Senior Panduola and Dake in the library the day before yesterday, his mentality changed. At least I can't lose to him by too much. White gritted his teeth and poured magic power into his fingertips. Puff! There was a soft sound. The magic ball flew out and smashed into Professor Kazair's head. Then, at the moment of contact, some kind of irritated defense system reacted. The magic ball was bounced back. With a bang, it hit White's left eye. Ow! The introduction to magic ended in the students' discussion. Except for the occasional glances at White's panda eyes, it was no different from usual. Don't be like this, White. It was just an accident. Luoboat looked at the dejected White and tried to comfort him. I know it was an accident. White gritted his teeth. But it shouldn't have happened. Luoboat shrugged. Nothing shouldn't have happened. Look, didn't Doran also send the magic ball flying? That's different. White suddenly raised his head and pointed at the bruise around his left eye. His eye didn't become like this. Luoboat. Okay, let's go find Sister Kalien and get some potions. White, ah. As there were fewer and fewer people in the classroom, Dake also packed up his books and was ready to leave. Deanna turned to him and asked worriedly, "Will this really work?" Dake blinked and said frankly, "I don't know." "Deanna, huh?" Luosi chuckled. Deanna looked down at the magic pen in her hand and felt distressed. She didn't succeed in her attempt on the podium. In fact, apart from Dake, only AI Ma seemed to have mastered it. After leaving the podium, Dake taught her a technique called pen spin. By manipulating the magic pen to rotate at close range, one could start from proficiency and gradually increase the distance until the magic pen could fly. However, this technique was completely invented by Dake while he was practicing. If it were someone else, they would have thrown the magic pen back into their bag in anger. However, Deanna trusted Dake unconditionally and was still practicing pen spin even after she picked up her bag. They walked all the way to the cafeteria. The three of them took their plates and found a place to sit by the wall of the cafeteria. Deanna spun the pen before the meal and continued to do so after the meal. Luosi watched for a long time and couldn't help but take out the magic pen to learn. Anyway, there was no harm in learning more. It didn't matter if it was useful or not. Besides, this pen spin was really fun. Potions class in the afternoon. Professor Thompson slightly increased the difficulty of the class. Sheng Malian's teaching span was actually quite large at each stage. The span between the first semester and the second semester of the first grade was normal. However, when it came to the second grade, the little mages would find that all the content seemed to have skipped a level. When it came to the third grade, the span would be even larger. This was related to the system of magical engineering knowledge. It was also related to the Sheng Malian's teaching style. This was not an early childhood education, nor was it a happy education. If one wanted to succeed in learning, autonomy was very important. In addition to the content in class, using the library well was a good way to keep up with the curriculum. And in this world, the age of 12 was the last stage of ignorance. From the age of 12 to 14, no matter if it was a boy or a girl, they would mature very quickly. During wartime, it was common for 14-year-olds to inherit the family business, get married, and have children. However, in the relative peace of more than 10 years, society's requirements for children's intelligence had been relaxed a lot. The age of adulthood, at the age of 14, was delayed to 16. And there was a trend of it being delayed to 18. However, the Sheng Malian's teaching system did not keep up with the changes of the times. Many of its teaching concepts were still in the style of wartime. This was the inevitable delay of an ancient castle. The difficulty of the content taught in this magic potions class made some of the students complain incessantly. In order to help the students master this part of the content, a lot of homework was given, which drowned the students' thoughts. A lot of people suddenly woke up at this time. A new semester had arrived. For a time, the library was full of the youthful figures of the first grade students. Dake was also in the crowd in the library. In order to finish his homework as quickly as possible, he worked a little harder than usual. He finally finished his homework before 5:30 in the afternoon. Then, under the resentful gaze of Deanna and Luosi, he packed his bag and walked out of the reading room. Clack. It was the sound of Deanna's magic pen falling on the table after it failed to spin the pen. White, who was sitting in a corner of the reading room, lost the opportunity to raise his head and caught sight of Dake's back. "It's done so quickly?" Looking down at the homework that was only half done, White scratched his head. He turned his head and suddenly found that Luo Boat's progress was faster than his. The underachiever was scratching his head. The top student was partying all night. Dake came to the counter. Panduola saw him and waved. Dake walked behind the counter and pulled a stool to sit down. Panduola closed her book and said, "Wait a little longer, Ms. Bella will be here to take over." Dake thought for a while and said, "Senior, why don't we wait until the weekend?" Panduola asked innocently, "Why wait until the weekend?" Dake said, "We can only go to the cafeteria now. After all, Traveler's Street was only open on weekends." Since he was treating her to thank her for her help, it was not good to give her free food in the cafeteria. Panduola said seriously, "That's true, then today's meal will be the interest." 2 in 1, 4,000 words. Chapter 254. This was the second time the two of them ate together in the cafeteria. The first time was when he first created the fusion card. The meaningful smiles of the halfling chefs were still fresh in Dark's mind. The food in the Shengmalian cafeteria was actually very delicious. The halfling chef's culinary skills were no worse than the chefs in the restaurants on Traveler's Street. If there was a flaw, it would be that the menu was fixed every day. The students could only choose their favorite food from the limited menu. Dake glanced at the menu and suddenly had an idea. He made up his mind and did not line up. "Senior, follow me." Panduola curiously followed Dake to the entrance of the kitchen. The halfling chefs were always gentle and reasonable. Dake communicated with one of the chefs and obtained the right to use a corner of the kitchen. He rolled up his sleeves and prepared to cook himself. Remember, https://m, VIP can't you? VIP. The status of chefs in the kingdom was actually not high, but this did not prevent the nobles from cooking for various reasons. However, Panduola was still surprised when she saw Dake's eagerness. "Do you need help?" A halfling chef walked over in a very friendly manner. Dake thought for a while and did not refuse. The halfling chefs also had their own duties and were responsible for the kitchen. On the surface, they were here to help, but in fact they were here to supervise. This was to prevent the students from burning down the kitchen on a whim. Such an incident had happened before. Dake felt that since he had already borrowed the kitchen, he should not make things difficult for the halfling chefs, so he agreed. Thus, with the help of the halfling chef, he quickly prepared the corresponding ingredients and began to cook the ribs. "Are you going to make rib soup?" the halfling chef asked curiously. Dake shook his head and smiled. No. After the last time they ate together in the cafeteria, he had some understanding of Senior's taste. He knew that she liked to eat meat, and that her taste was on the sweet side, especially salty and sweet. At that time, Dake had thought of showing off his cooking skills, but he had never tried it. Since he had the chance today, he might as well satisfy her taste buds and try to make sweet and sour pork ribs. Among the various savory and sweet Chinese dishes, the cooking requirements of sweet and sour pork ribs were actually relatively simple. The requirements for the ingredients were not high either. As long as there was pork chops, vinegar, rock sugar, and some supplementary ingredients, it would be fine. In the halfling chef's kitchen, you could find almost anything you wanted. Dake poured the water into the pot and boiled it. Then he blanched the pork ribs and added some ginger slices and cooking wine to get rid of the fishy smell. Then he scooped out the pork ribs and rinsed off the foam. He poured hot oil into the pan and fried it. Then he added ginger slices and garlic. After the ribs were fried until the surface was golden brown, they were served. Then he added oil, sugar, and stir-fried the sugar in the wok. When the rock sugar melted, the color gradually darkened, and after stir-frying a beautiful sugar color, he poured in the fried ribs and stir-fried them evenly, so that a layer of sugar color hung on the ribs evenly. Finally, add water and boil it. Bring it to a boil and simmer it slowly. All kinds of spices were added. Then the sauce was collected under high heat. A sweet and sour pork ribs with a sweet and sour flavor was ready to be served. Dake forked a piece of pork ribs and gently bit into it. The silky and soft texture spread throughout his mouth. The perfect combination of sweetness and saltiness made the cells in his bone marrow jump. A treasured knife is not old yet. He nodded in satisfaction. Dake forked another piece of boneless meat and handed it to Panduola. "Try it." The hot air in the kitchen made Panduola's face slightly red. She lifted the hair that fell to the side of her ears and lowered her head slightly. She opened her moist lips and bit into her junior's meat with her snow-white teeth. The sweet and sour taste that seeped into her nose had already stimulated her taste buds. Now, as soon as it entered her mouth, the accumulated anticipation instantly exploded. Panduola couldn't help but chew faster. The redness on her face became more and more intense. It suited her taste too well, whether it was the human or the meat. The pork ribs were served with a few side dishes and bread. The two of them ate in a corner of the cafeteria. Dake ate the sweet and sour pork ribs that he hadn't eaten in a long time, but he felt a little regretful. The sweet and sour pork ribs without rice always felt like it lacked soul. He couldn't help but whisper, "I wonder where we can find rice, Panduola." Dake looked up, and saw that her cheeks were puffed up. There was a layer of oil on her lips, and she revealed a rare expression. The regret in his heart instantly disappeared. He smiled and said, "It's nothing." Perhaps the rice in this world was waiting for him to discover it in some corner. If one day he could travel the world like Aunt Claire, he might really be able to find it. Panduola only had time to speak after the large plate of sweet and sour pork ribs was cleared. She licked her lips reluctantly and said regretfully, "That's all." "Dake, that's all. I'll make it next time." Panduola, "Okay." Dake asked curiously, "Senior, have you joined any clubs?" Panduola wiped the oil from the corner of her mouth with a napkin and said casually, "I have, but it's just in name. After all, I still have a job in the library." "Why? Are you already thinking about joining a club?" "Dake, I just wanted to ask." Panduola looked up and said, "Let me think. I should join the literature club." "Dake, literature club?" Panduola, "Look, isn't being a librarian and a literature club very compatible?" Dake, "Indeed." Panduola, "Speaking of which, I haven't participated in any club activities in the past 2 years. I don't know if I've been removed from their list." When she said this, a smile appeared on her face. It seemed that she was very satisfied with the literature club that hadn't disturbed her. Her schedule was very tight to begin with. The time for the students to participate in club activities completely overlapped with the working hours of the librarian. She chose to work as a librarian in 2 choices, so she naturally gave up on club research. Dake chatted for a while and roughly understood what she meant. He then gave up on the idea of pulling her into a future club. There was no need to forcefully change her pace of life because of his own wishes. The reason why he suddenly had this idea was because the school had a minimum number of people to establish a club. No matter what club it was, after it was approved, it had to recruit at least 5 people within a month. Back then, the Magical Animals Club maintained a minimum of 5 people. When the 5 people graduated at the same time, it naturally disappeared. Dake wasn't in a hurry. This semester had just begun, and the club would be established next year. Including himself, there were already 3 candidates for the club. There were only 2 left. When the time came, it wouldn't be a problem to find another one. Maybe when the time came, there would be no need to find another one. There was always a limit to happy times. After the 2 ate and drank their fill, they chatted for 10 minutes before saying goodbye to each other. Panduola was actually very busy. She was a week late and had a lot of homework to deal with. Whether it was yesterday or today, she had to take time out of her busy schedule. Fortunately, not only did she suck in a junior, she also ate his flesh. Today she was satisfied. After Dake sent her to the library, he turned around and returned to the tower of the aristocrat house. He was also very busy. At this time, the sky was completely dark. The moon and stars hung high in the sky, and the ancient castle was covered in a layer of silver dust. A hole suddenly opened in the empty night sky. A witch riding a pumpkin carriage entered through the entrance of the barrier. She circled around the castle and stopped at the dragon-taming platform under the guidance of magic. As the vice principal of the school, Professor Shi-Erfu had been waiting for a long time on the dragon-taming platform. Her light golden hair was long and transparent. The ends of her long hair seemed to have merged with the wind. But with a serious face that didn't match her stunning beauty, she exuded an aura that kept people away. But as the pumpkin carriage landed, her expression relaxed slightly, and the air that had almost condensed into a piece quickly melted. A tall lady dressed as a witch opened the curtains and walked out of the carriage. "My dear Midya, you're finally here." Professor Shi-Erfu stopped for a moment and went to greet her. Midya Bartholomew raised her long legs that were tightly wrapped in purple stockings and stepped down from the carriage. She was wearing a pitch-black witch's robe and a pointed witch's hat. However, the tight-fitting robe perfectly accentuated her mature figure. Her amazingly long eyelashes and light purple eyeshadow combined together gave her a flirtatious aura. The purple gauze covering her nose revealed a hazy beauty. Although she was a witch, she looked more like a graceful and luxurious noble lady. Midya landed on the ground and casually flicked a star to illuminate the dim dragon-taming platform. "Sarah Shi-Erfu, long time no see." Midya smiled. "Like a noble lady. She lifted the hem of her witch robe and stepped on a pair of crystal high heels. She elegantly walked in front of Shi-Erfu. The two were obviously old acquaintances, but the relationship between them was probably not as warm as it appeared on the surface. Professor Shi-Erfu sighed. I didn't expect you to accept the headmaster's invitation. I thought with your personality, you would refuse without hesitation. Midya smiled. Putting a little shackle on myself occasionally has a different flavor. I heard that there are some extraordinary people in this batch of students I'm going to teach. Professor Shi-Erfu shook his head. There are no extraordinary people. They're just a few kids. Midya's eyes reflected the silver moon. Her smile grew wider. Great people are born great. Their destinies are already predestined. Professor Shi-Erfu said helplessly. Put away your fatalism. This is the school of magic. Midya. But it wasn't. Professor Shi-Erfu didn't say anything. Midya. Let me familiarize myself with the castle. Professor Shi-Erfu was surprised. It's already so late? Midya's lips curled up. Isn't it common sense for witches to travel at night? The corner of Professor Shi-Erfu's eyes twitched slightly, but she controlled her emotions. Come with me. The starry sky tonight is so beautiful. Dake glanced at the night sky. Then he lowered his head and continued to squeeze out pride from the branches of the worm tree. He had just pulled out today's pride and had a total of 10 points. Now it was time to make pride 3. Until today, Dark was already very familiar with making the big sin cards within the 3 range. The Great Sin card, which was based on the refining method of the emotion card, belonged to the relatively simple category. The probability of failure was very low. What really bothered him was the Great Sin series that followed. No matter how he looked at it, the refining method of the emotion card could not support the refining of the Great Sin card. But it was useless to think about this now. He still needed to accumulate a lot more knowledge before he could capture that glimmer of inspiration. Before starting the refining, Dake drank a glass of apple juice to refresh himself. Then he used the Dark Spirit spell to concentrate. Finally, he succeeded in getting rid of some hasty thoughts and made himself cautious. In fact, he did not have the luxury to accept failure. 10 points of pride needed a whole 7 days to accumulate. If he really failed, it would make his mood very bad. When the magic elves saw him start the experiment, they all quieted down. The big milkkin brought the 3 happy cat plants to the balcony to watch the stars, so that they would not disturb their master at an inopportune time. Everything was ready. Dake calmed down and started the refining of Pride 3. About an hour later, the needle of the clock turned from 7:30 to 8:30. A dark gold magic card with a deeper color than Pride 2 was finally formed. This magic card emitted a strong aura. It did not feel cold at all in the cold winter night. With a slight touch, the coldness of the fingers was dispelled by a warm current. The symbol of pride was the sun, the light that illuminated the earth. This Pride 3 was obviously more of the sun's aura than Pride 2. Yes, this is my aura. The little fiend magic beast jumped up. It had been staring at the experiment table for a long time. Since it could not avoid every experiment, it had to at least figure out what the experiment was about. Bliss would affect its flapping speed, and only pride was worthy of its sin. The little fiend magic beast felt unusually excited. Was it coming? Was it coming? Was it coming? However, Dake's gaze swept past it and landed on little Ibu, who was curled up in the round cushion. Bliss 3. Moon could make Ibu-chan evolve into Moon Ibu. Bliss 3 could make Ibu-chan evolve into Fairy Ibu. Then what about Pride 3? It should be Sun Ibu, right? Dake was quite confident in his prediction. But before he experimented, he could not be sure. He waved at Ibu-chan, and little Ibu-chan, who had been staring at them all this time, immediately stood up. The book said, "Practice makes perfect." Did that mean that after evolving many times, it could learn to evolve on its own? Since Bliss 3 could make it evolve, the new card in Master's hand should be able to do the same, right? It could not wait. Ibu-chan, who felt the envious gaze, was jumping as it walked. 2 in 1 4,000 words. Chapter 255. Dake reached out and put Ibu on his knees, scratching the skin under its chin out of habit. Then he used a normal summoning spell and activated Pride 3. Pride's coat of arms was the red of the sun, but after being refined into a card, it was dark gold, and the light it emitted was also of the same color. Pride 2's light was more towards black, deeper. Pride 3's light was more towards gold, more glorious. When Pride 3's light illuminated every corner of the bedroom with the surge of magic, all the magic elves were unavoidably affected, and the way they looked at their surroundings changed. However, only the little fiendish beast grinned. It's a familiar smell. In the center of the light, Pride's coat of arms slowly appeared on Ibu-chan's forehead. It raised its head slightly, and the dark gold light around it quickly converged into the coat of arms. As the light converged, the coat of arms gradually heated up, and the golden light became more and more glorious. Website: https://m, but can't you? VIP like the blazing sun, high in the sky, overlooking the day. Suddenly, the golden light exploded. From top to bottom, it completely covered Ibu-chan's body. Its form underwent a drastic change in the golden light. Its round limbs became slender. Its fluffy tail forked at the end. The golden light gradually dissipated. A small feline creature that was even smaller than the fairy Ibu came into view. Sun Ibu. It really is Sun Ibu. Sun Ibu, who looked like a purple fairy, had a slender body after evolving. Its entire body was covered with soft and fine purple hair, which felt like velvet to the touch. It was said that it could use its fur to feel the flow of air, and use it to detect changes in the weather and the movements of its opponents. Its forehead was embedded with a red gem, and its slender tail was forked at the end, just like the legendary Nicomida. If one looked closely, they would find that within the gem, the coat of arms of Pride faintly appeared. In order to understand Sun Ibu's changes more clearly, Dake had already taken Ibu-chan's magic card. He injected a bit of magic and received information. Card name: Magical Beast Sun Ibu. Type: Fairy card. Level: Race: Bird. Attribute: Super Magic Power. 2000 Attack. 1700 Defense. 900 Ultimate Skills. Magic Mirror, Psychokinesis, Future Prediction. As expected, 3 skills. As expected, the Evolve Sun Ibu was a 4-star orange card. The magic value at the peak of the 4-star peak, the barely acceptable attack value, and the lousy defense value made this magic card have its own characteristics. But beyond the surface stats, Sun Ivan also possessed extraordinary dexterity and speed. As for the 3 sure kill skills he had mastered, to be honest, they were all divine skills. Magic Mirror, a sure kill skill based on its hidden characteristics, was a passive skill that could be called a bug. Magic Mirror, reflect magic when the user is in the field. Nullify part of the target's transformation skills, and reflect them back to the user of the skill. Transformation skills referred to skills that did not directly deal damage to the opponent, but instead applied abnormal status or status changes to the opponent, thereby changing the opponent's value or status. For example, the Basti Beast's Chaos was a transformation-type skill. White's Forbidden Love. AI Ma's Gold Treasure Chest. The Sphinx's Shadow Stomp. All of them belonged to the category of transformation skills. This meant that Sun Ivan, who had the passive skill Magic Mirror, could be completely unaffected by these powerful skills, and could even reflect them back. For the first-year students who lacked the means to dispel curses, a magic fairy with this skill was the nemesis of those who tried to control others. Dake lowered his head to look at Sun Ivan, who was curled up on his knees, and gently stroked the soft short fur on its back, slightly puzzled. A magic fairy that had evolved under the effects of Pride 3 should be more active. For example, climbing to the top of the cat tree and shouting, "I am the great bright star," or something like that. It was rare for Sun Ivan to have such a mild reaction. But at an angle that he did not notice, Sun Ivan was squinting at the other magic fairies, the pride in his heart gradually accumulating. Perhaps in the eyes of this Sun Ivan's knees were the highest throne. Although he didn't understand, Dake didn't think too much about it. He was more focused on Sun Ivan's ultimate skill. For magic fairies, ultimate skills were their true soul. A good ultimate skill could completely make people ignore the inadequacy of their 3 body parts. Of Son Ivan's 3 skills other than Magic Mirror, they were all pretty good. The second ultimate skill, Telekinesis. Although it was a super ability with very low power, it had a wide range of practical uses. Telekinesis. Send a weak telekinesis attack to the opponent, sometimes causing the opponent to be confused. It was more like a super ability user's super ability. Not only could it be used to attack, but it could also be used on moving objects. More importantly, it had no cooldown, but it consumed magic every time it was used. This was a huge advantage. As for the third sure kill skill, Future Prediction, it was literally a sure kill skill that could be developed in depth. Future Foresight. Foresight of the future, causing the designated area to fall into a future attack state. After 30 seconds, the future attack state will be removed, and the opponent in the area will receive super ability attribute damage. Future Foresight. S power wasn't inferior to Destruction Ray, in the slightest. If the foresight factor wasn't taken into account, just from the description, it was a trap-type skill with a delayed effect. Setting the trap 30 seconds in advance, and then exploding 30 seconds later, dealing AoE damage to the enemy. Under special circumstances, this sure kill skill could often produce unexpected results. For example, after Son Ivan used Future Foresight, he could sacrifice it. The opponent would summon a magic fairy 30 seconds later, and would still receive the attack of Future Foresight. On the other hand, Future Foresight also meant that Son Ivan had the ability to foresee. If this skill could be developed in depth, it could even give Son Ivan the ability to see the future. In battle, he could rely on foresight to dodge the opponent's attacks, thus making up for his lack of defense. Furthermore, if the Son Ivan could learn and grasp more knowledge, there was a high probability that he could become a genuine diviner, or in other words, a prophet, and not one of those old swindlers. All in all, Dake was very satisfied with Son Ivan's 3 ultimate skills. For normal magic fairies, these skills could only be considered powerful ultimate skills, but for a magic fairy with high intelligence, it was a sign of great potential. Dake was even considering whether or not he should bring Son Ivan to sit in on the next astronomy class. LARP, he accidentally used a bit of force while stroking the cat, and Son Ivan immediately let out a slight protest. Even though she sounded like she was acting coquettishly, one could still hear the arrogance of someone who was second only to one and above everyone else. As expected, pride is still pride. Dake immediately relaxed. Since there's still time, let's test this skill. With that thought, Dake raised his head to look at the little fiend and said, "Little fiend, come here." The little fiend tilted its head and asked, "Is it my turn? Why is it so fast today?" Although its face was full of doubt, the little fiend still flew to the experiment table and obediently stood there. Dake took out Pride too, and shot a dark golden ball of light at it. "Is that all?" The little fiend shook its head, slightly dissatisfied. Moto Moto. As its mind gradually matured, and after experiencing the effects of pride many times, the little fiend's endurance had clearly increased. Just Pride 2 was no longer enough to make it lose its composure. Dake had noticed this problem, but it wasn't the topic of today's research. He picked up the Sun Ibu on his knees, making it face outwards, and wrapped his arms around it. Then he said to the little fiend, "Come use demon hypnosis on it." Can I really?" The little fiend's eyes lit up, and joy appeared in the depths of its eyes. This Ivan had been glaring at it ever since it evolved, and it had been unhappy for a long time. It never thought that an opportunity would fall from the sky, and that it would be able to use its master's name to punish it so quickly. Isn't it just an early evolution? What's so great about it? I'll let you see Sir Little Fiend's power. Thinking this, the little fiend suddenly spread its wings and looked down at the Son Ivan in Dake's arms. Its eyes suddenly opened wide. Demon hypnosis. Immediately, circles of hypnosis ripples were released from its eyes. The little fiend's mouth curved into a Nike shape because of this. But in the next moment, the moment Ivan's hypnotic ripples came into contact with the sun, they quickly returned to where they came from and shot towards its head. The little fiend was caught off guard and couldn't react at all, so it took the full brunt of his demon hypnosis. Its mind shook, and it instantly shut down, falling from the sky with a plop. Sun Ivan, psychokinesis. The Sun Ivan opened its eyes, and the red gem on its forehead glowed red. The little fiend's body was picked up the moment it was about to hit the ground. But although it was in the air, it had been hypnotized to sleep. So it really can be done? Purely using psychokinesis to move objects and not attack. Dake nodded slightly, and then said, "Put the little fiend on the bed for now." The Sun Ivan wanted to use his psychokinesis to raise it higher, but if he wasn't careful, his psychokinesis would run out, and cause it to fall to the ground even more miserably. But since its master had already given the order, it could only regretfully give up. Magic mirror and psychokinesis have already been tested. Next is future foresight. Dake thought for a bit, and then put the Sun Ivan on the ground. Although the Sun Ivan was reluctant, it still landed on all fours. After leaving its master's arms, it raised its chin high, and the arrogance in its heart made it lose its previous modesty and cautiousness. It looked at Fairy Ivan and the Diru beast with eyes full of arrogance and disdain. In its past fantasies, these two magic guide fairies were trash that it would defeat sooner or later. Especially the fairy Evie. She was its greatest imaginary enemy. The Diru beast on the cat tree snorted coldly. It was also arrogant, so it could clearly feel Sun Ivan's thoughts. But it crossed its chest and didn't feel threatened. Fairy Ivan was calm on the outside, but its ribbon tentacles curled and uncurled. "Mayu, I'll deal with you tonight." "Bibi." The Sun Ivan's ears suddenly stood up, and the ruby on its forehead lit up. But Dake's hand pressed down on its head in time, causing the light to dim once more. Dake greedily enjoyed the soft touch while sweeping his gaze over the magic guide fairies one by one. Finally, he set his sights on the Hawkman. "Hawkman, come here for a bit." "Acha." The Hawkman immediately spread its wings and flexed its muscles. But Dake said, "Can you try shooting out the feathers of Feather Dance one by one?" The Hawkman. Future foresight. As power was too great, so Dake obviously couldn't test it indoors. What he really wanted to test was the Sun Ivan's foresight ability. According to his memories, the Sun Ivan could use its thin and short body hair to predict its opponent's movements from the movement of the air. But this kind of high-end operation was definitely not something that Ivan of the Sun could do. But the Sun Ivan who had grasped future foresight shouldn't have any problems in theory. He explained his thoughts, then got up and left, making space for the Hawkman and the Sun Ivan to fight to their heart's content. The two magic guide fairies stood on the left and right. The Sun Ivan raised its head, its temperament elegant and noble. Its long, forked tail swayed gently in the air, and all the hair on its body stretched out, feeling the movement of the air. The Hawkman was completely focused. Even if it was just an experimental contest, it would still go all out. "Hacha!" With a light shout, the Hawkman fiercely flapped its wings, and a few feathers quickly condensed. Then, only one of them shot out under its control. The rest of the feathers fell to the ground. This was clearly a sign that its control wasn't precise enough. But it had already done its best. The Sun Ivan subconsciously wanted to use telekinesis to block the feather, but the ruby on its forehead flickered, and its master's words floated to its mind. Then it tilted its head slightly to the left, and that feather flew past its slender neck, falling to the ground due to the loss of energy. Without waiting for it to reveal a smug smile. "Hacha! Hacha!" The Hawkman had already shot out two feathers at the same time. Feather Dance had a cooldown, and it needed to continuously attack in order to maintain its cooldown. The Sun Ivan's tail swayed slightly, and it jumped a little, once again easily dodging the two consecutive feather shots. Then, the Hawkman slowly increased the number and speed of the feathers. But the Sun Ivan could always dodge before it was hit by the feathers. It was as if it could really foresee the future. Chapter 256. But after careful observation, Dake was a bit disappointed. Even though the Sun Evu probably had the potential to be a prophet, the ability it was currently displaying was only prediction, not foresight. At the moment, the only thing that involved the ability of foresight was probably future foresight itself. There was still a long way to go before Ibu could become a prophet. Around 16 minutes later, Pride 3. effect gradually disappeared, and Sun Ibu reverted back to Ibu. The sudden change from a pair of long legs to a pair of short legs caused Ibu-chan to be a little confused, but it quickly came back to its senses, and the arrogance on its face disappeared, leaving behind an innocent and cute face. Ibu-chan pretended to be unconscious as she avoided Fairy Ibu's line of sight. She took small steps towards Dark with her short legs. When it was in front of Dake, it lowered its head and rubbed its head against his leg. Remember the URL? VIP can't you? VIP Dake helplessly picked it up and rubbed its head, praising, "Well done." Ibu raised its chin and acted like a fox pretending to be a tiger. After recording the results, Dake cleaned up the experiment and took advantage of the time when Pride 3 was on cooldown to wash up. After coming out of the bathroom, he read a book for a while until Pride 3's cooldown ended. Very standard time, 61 minutes. Dake smiled and waved at the little fiend. The little fiend had been waiting the whole time. Sun Ibu's evolution had given it a lot of stimulation, and it had never wanted to cooperate so much before. At this moment, he immediately hopped over with a jolt of his butt. Dake waved Pride 3 and asked, "You want to evolve?" The little fiend nodded like a chick pecking at rice. Dake then asked, "What do you want to evolve into?" The little fiend was dumbfounded. There was a choice? Plus, even if there was a choice, shouldn't there be a list of A, B, C, D? It didn't know what else it could evolve into apart from becoming a Heidi Road beast. Could it be that I can evolve into other forms like Ibu? The little demonic beast's heart stirred, and it became even more expectant. Bliss 3 allowed it to evolve into a cat. It wasn't that it didn't like cats, but cats weren't domineering at all. A great little demon beast should at least evolve into a ferocious beast like a lion or tiger. And Pride 3 was obviously the magic card that could satisfy its expectations. A lion, a tiger, or a dragon? As the little fiend waited, Dake activated Pride 3. Magician summoning. Suddenly, a brilliant light shone out. The little demonic beast was bathed in the radiance, and it couldn't help but squint its eyes proudly. The skull pattern on its forehead faded and turned into the standard Pride emblem. The dark golden light released from Pride 3 was instantly absorbed by the emblem and then exploded. With the Pride emblem as the center, the little demonic beast's body gradually turned into a dark golden light, just like when it evolved into a Diru beast under the effect of Bliss 3. Under the effect of Pride 3, the little fiend's life structure underwent a drastic change. At this moment, all the magic fairies couldn't help but focus their gazes on the little fiend. The feeling of being the center of attention made the little fiend very happy. It could feel that the power flowing in its body was the pride that opened its spiritual wisdom, but it was more turbulent and purer. I am the bright star, the son of dawn. I will eventually rise to the sky and hold my throne above the stars. The little fiend suddenly opened its eyes, and its eyes revealed a bone-chilling arrogance. The world in its eyes was constantly shrinking and dwarfing. That was its sublimation. It was rising to a higher place. To put it simply, it had become taller. From a short body with only a head, it became a tall human figure. But its condition wasn't as good as it thought. Dake was extremely shocked to find that the little fiend's evolution had stagnated at an extremely subtle stage. Although its body grew into a tall human figure, it didn't completely materialize, and it still maintained the state of a light body. The black and gold that made up Pride actually separated during this evolution process. The black light that symbolized darkness, the golden light that symbolized light. The two torrents of light continued to converge, impact, and disperse in its body. In the end, they were unevenly divided into two sides. On the left were huge curved horns and broken bat wings, as well as huge hooked claws that hung below the knees like pipes. On the right was a helmet that covered the eyes, 3 complete wings, and a strong arm that protruded with muscles, even though it was only the outline of a light body. However, Dake, who had a deep impression of these two forms, was still able to distinguish them after a short period of shock. The left is a demon beast, and the right is an angel beast? Dake's understanding of digital beasts basically came from the first few animations of Digimon, so he didn't have a complete understanding of the system of digital beasts, and there were many things that he didn't have a clue about. However, these demon beasts and angel beasts occupied a lot of space in the first Digimon. That was the source of his deep impression. In addition, the unstable phenomenon in front of him immediately reminded him of the phenomenon after using Bliss 3 Moon on the Diru beast. That was the confrontation and fusion of light and darkness, the reincarnation of angels and demons. It was through that phenomenon that Dake thought of fusion and began to research it, fusing the Diru beast and the Diru beast into the Basti beast. Does this mean that angel beasts and demon beasts can also fuse and evolve? Light and darkness were two sides of the same coin. As early as when he discovered that the proportion of golden light in the light emitted by Pride 3 was larger than before, Dake realized that it was no longer purely evil. Perhaps because Dake's thoughts, actions, and soul were more and more inclined to the side of light, so the great sin extracted from his mind was also affected. I do remember that the fairy beast and the witch beast can fuse and evolve into an angel-type digital beast that fuses light and darkness, the Most High beast. But what can angel beasts and demon beasts fuse and evolve into? Dake gave up thinking. It wasn't the time to think about this. The little demon beast wasn't in a good state at the moment. The wrong evolution of the digital beast would lead to more than just evolving from a Tyrannosaurus beast into a zombie Satan beast. More often than not, poop beasts and snot beasts were their final destination. If it wasn't handled properly, the little demon beast might mistakenly evolve into a prideful poop beast. When he thought of that terrible possibility, Dake couldn't help but feel a chill on the back of his neck and shiver. Many thoughts flashed through his mind. Dake carefully observed the state of the little demon beast's body. The black and gold torrents of light were evenly matched, but the gold torrent was actually slightly inferior. This was probably because Pride 3 ultimately originated from the sin of pride. Darkness was the root. Light was an outsider. But this wasn't the key. How to guide the black and gold light in the direction of one side and let the other side nibble away might be the key to breaking this situation. And the darkness was deeply rooted, so it was more likely to be the dominant one. Then the best way was to contain the gold light that symbolized light. It wasn't difficult to achieve this. Dake thought for a moment and took out Pride Eye from his card pack. One Pride Eye was enough to make the balance imbalance. And once it formed a memory, the next time Pride 3 was used, it was very likely that this intermediate state would not appear again. Of course, this was just a guess. Magic summoning. Pride Eye was instantly activated, and a dark golden ball of light shot into the little demon beast's head. Pride Eye, which was more inclined towards darkness, became the last straw that broke the balance. The black light gradually suppressed the gold light. It fused into an even deeper black-gold color, and the little demon beast's evolution had finally been completed. Roar. Accompanied by a fierce roar, the broken bat wings angrily spread out. The little demon beast that had evolved into a demon beast instantly soared into the air. But the narrow bedroom couldn't accommodate its height. The back of its head was pressed against the ceiling, and its dark red glowing eyes looked down, revealing an arrogance that was close to ferocious. The fallen angel-type digital beast was wrapped in pitch-black clothes, revealing only the pale skin around its mouth. Its chest was printed with a scarlet bat-like mark, and multiple black belts were tied around its waist. Below its knees, there were forearms that could stretch out freely and huge sharp claws of death. I am the demon beast, the fallen angel, the king of darkness. Card name, demon beast. Type, elf card. Race, fiend. Attribute, dark. Magic power, 2000. Attack, 2000. Defense, 2000. Ultimate skills, claw of death, razor wings, teleport, claw of 10,000 deaths. Curse cage, demon beast, shining with a golden halo, was another rare gold card that had been upgraded from a blue card. The demon beast in front of him was so powerful that it made people tremble. Compared to the Hedala beast, magic power, 1500. Attack, 1900. Defense, 900. The demon beast's 3 attributes were simply godly among the 4-star monsters. It was truly invulnerable. The horrifying value of both magic attack and defense meant that it was powerful in all aspects with no blind spots. Among the 4 ultimate skills, there were a total of 3 pure destructive skills. Claw of Death. Extend the freely retractable hands and instantly pierce through the opponent's body. Razor wings. Release a wing-shaped beam of destructive energy from the wings to attack the opponent. Claw of 10,000 deaths. Release a large number of Claw of Death at the same time. Teleport. Under the control of your mind, teleport from your current location to your desired destination in an instant. The only non-destructive skill was the teleport skill that could be called a bug. Dake had always been envious of Principal Aerdi's teleportation-like movement method. Now that he had the demon beast, it seemed like he could do it too? What was unknown at the moment was how far the demon beast's teleport could move, whether it could carry people, and how long the cooldown was. From the feedback from Curse Cage, Demon Beast, he could clearly understand the release methods of the other 3 ultimate skills and their general effects. Currently, there was no need to test them indoors. Only teleport could be used to test without being affected. Dake was thinking about the differences between teleport and blink, when he suddenly noticed that the demon beast's eyes were a little strange. Claw of Death. Suddenly, the demon beast twisted its body, its eyes flashing scarlet. Its pitch-black left hand suddenly swung out and instantly elongated. The giant claw filled with the aura of death viciously grabbed at the defenseless fairy Ibu. The demon beast would never forget when it was still a little demon beast. Every night when it wanted to crawl into its master's bed, that damned fairy Ibu would use a ribbon to tie it up like a dumpling and throw it out. The humiliation that accumulated night after night finally exploded when pride poured into its brain. The powerful strength that filled its body gave it an extremely strong killing intent. The enmity of being attacked. If it didn't take revenge now, when would it? Me. Fairy Ibu felt the aura of death approaching. In an instant, her hair stood on end. The 2 ribbon antennae almost instinctively shot out, but were instantly pushed back by the Claw of Death. That elongated giant claw didn't stop at all, and was about to pierce through its chest. A white shadow suddenly flashed by. The light aura of the dilute beast was stimulated and exploded. It suddenly jumped down from the top of the cat tree, and copied the claws of the golden sword lion. It broke through the aura of death and clawed at the center of the demon beast's claw. In a confrontation of pure strength, the dilute beast actually had the upper hand. The demon beast's giant claw couldn't move an inch forward. But at this time, it was filled with arrogance and revealed a ferocious expression. It didn't hesitate to reach out its other hand, Death Blade. Little demon beast. A harsh reprimand suddenly poured into its ears. The demon beast's body suddenly trembled, and felt a chill all over its body. The multiple Claw of Death that was about to condense instantly disappeared. Even the left arm that was facing the dilute beast's palm fell down softly. The ferocious aura completely disappeared. The demon beast twisted its neck like a rusty gear, and faced its master, who showed true fury for the first time in front of it. Fury +3. The system prompt that floated in front of Dake's eyes calmed down his emotions. In his opinion, the small squabbles between the magic elves were not a big deal. At best, he attributed it to the lack of moral education, which was something that could be resolved by singing, "Unity is strength," a few more times. When dealing with the Basti beast, he held this kind of attitude. Losing control of one's emotions due to great sin could indeed cause some bad things, but that was unavoidable during the first experiment. But this time, the demon beast didn't hide its strong killing intent at all. It exceeded the limit of his tolerance. Although Fairy Ibu wouldn't die even if she was pierced by the Claw of Death, there were some things that couldn't be ignored. But after calming down, Dake realized that this was the result of Pride 3 plus Pride I. He let out a sigh and lowered the punishment. Deduct 10 little red flowers. The evil magical beast instantly transformed into an evil ice magical beast. You can participate in the reward gathering for the lame plot. You don't need to have too much foundation, as long as the plot is interesting. Chapter 257. The demon beast looked on helplessly as the little red flower that it had painstakingly accumulated was emptied out. It was as if its entire body had been frozen, and it didn't have any other thoughts. It seems that pride and sadness don't conflict. Dake recorded the demon beast's reaction, and his understanding of Pride 3 increased. Then next is the experiment on instant teleportation. Dake used magic to turn the pin. After thinking for a bit, he said to the demon beast, "Perform it." The evil demon beast awoke from its sorrow and suddenly disappeared with a thought. Dark abruptly turned around, and the demon beast had already appeared behind him without making a sound. Too strong. There was no sign, no trace to be found. Just this experiment could show a lot of things. Dake asked, "How long will it take before you can teleport again?" The demon beast closed its eyes and thought carefully. It wasn't until 15 seconds later that it disappeared again and appeared on the cat tree. It sat on the top of the cat tree, overlooking the entire bedroom. It suddenly understood why the Diru beast was so obsessed with this place. Meow. A cat's cry came from below. The Diru beast looked up at the demon beast that occupied its territory. Although it didn't show much anger, there was a faint fire burning in its eyes. At this moment, with its master watching, it wasn't convenient. Before, when the demon beast attacked Fairy Ibu, it was stopped. It could see its master's position and inclination. It wasn't in a hurry now. Wait until the demon beast degenerated into a small demon beast, then settle the score. The Diru beast knew that the demon beast's evolution wouldn't last long, and pride would make a person's head dizzy, making it unable to see itself clearly. The conflict between light and darkness made the Diru beast stand on the opposite side of the demon beast from the beginning. Dake, who was paying attention to the time, finally had a clearer understanding of the cooldown of instant teleportation. In general, it was shorter than he had guessed. Instant teleportation could only be used once per round. Compared to the cooldowns of killing skills that were measured in minutes, it was much better. It was just that every time, instant teleportation used up 100 points of magic power. And this 100 points of magic power seemed to be just a base value. Once the distance of instant teleportation exceeded a certain limit, the magic power needed would greatly increase. And this limit? 100 meters. Dake came to the balcony and looked at the demon beast that was in the air with instant teleportation. He was quite satisfied. Then he had the shape-shifting monster turn into a dummy and had the demon beast carry it away. The teleportation was successful. However, the base mana cost had doubled from 100 to 200. The demon beast with magic power, it could only use instant teleportation 10 times. If it was a single ultimate teleportation, 2,000 points of magic power could only provide one person with 1,000 meters of instant teleportation, or two people with 500 meters of instant teleportation. It was more than enough to escape at a time. Of course, it could also be used. Due to the excessive consumption of mana, the fiend demonic beast turned back into a small demonic beast after only 14 minutes. The demon beast, that demon beast of the Diru beast to the ground. It was even careful when it walked, afraid that it would attract attention if it made too much noise. After pondering for a while, he suddenly had an idea. He took out a small bottle of sweet candies from his little bed and respectfully offered it to Immortal Eevee, expressing his sincere apologies to Immortal Eevee. Little demon beast, way. Dake couldn't help but slap his head when he saw this. It wasn't all good for the magic guide fairies to have full intelligence. As the head of the kindergarten in the tower of the noble house, he couldn't help but worry about the interpersonal relationships of the magic guide fairies. The relationship between the magic guide fairies didn't seem to be as harmonious as he imagined. Maybe I should organize some small activities to improve their relationship? Dake seriously thought, but was also a bit worried. What small activities could improve their relationship? The next day, Tuesday, the first dual class. Professor Cheong-si gave an unexpected assignment after the class ended. The 7 people who had successfully joined the dual club became the core of the project. These 7 people had to apply to the dual club on Friday to participate in the newcomers competition on Saturday. There was only one round of competition. After the competition, the contestants had to write a small paper analyzing the competition. The rest of the students had to watch the competition and choose one or more contestants to write a paper analyzing the situation of the duel with them as the core. This was very good for learning about duels, and it was very interesting. The first grade students were all very excited. Before the class ended, they were already actively discussing all kinds of things. Of course, it wasn't about how to write a small paper, but about how to support the competition. for example, forming a cheerleading team, making signs or banners to cheer them on, coming up with some slogans. They were clearly more interested in this than the assignment. But learning from entertainment and growing from learning was also a privilege for the children. The second period was immediately followed by the arithmetic class. This semester's arithmetic class had been pushed from simple calculations to more complex calculations, making those who didn't do well to begin with miserable. Arithmetic was the most difficult class of all, but this semester, it was still strongly advocated for. In particular, Professor Lily didn't understand what it meant to be simple. Often, the students would have to break down the problem into many small steps to solve, but she would be able to solve it with just a glance. Naturally, there were no steps in between. During the entire class, the classroom was like purgatory, filled with the painful cries of the students. Little Lily flew on the podium with a dumbfounded expression. She couldn't help but look at someone in the last row of the classroom for help. Dake sighed deeply. He realized that there was no unknown X in this lousy place's knowledge system. After the arithmetic class ended, Dake was called to the office by Professor Lily. "This batch of students is so stupid." Professor Lily complained as soon as she opened her mouth. "That's what I used to teach, but everyone can understand it." Dake sat down on the sofa and poured himself a cup of fairy flower tea. He patiently listened to her complaints, but in his heart he thought, "My lord, the times have changed. Peace will make people corrupt." In a sense, this was true. Without pressure, the children naturally wouldn't work so hard on their own. The last time Professor Lily taught a first-year class was 6 years ago. At that time, the people of the kingdom still had a strong sense of crisis. The family environment affected the children's psychology, so they worked much harder than this batch. Dake finished his cup of tea and said, "Then let's talk about equations and what are unknowns." "That's all I can do for now. I'll go to the hospital in the afternoon to make up for it. I'll think of a way to do more at night." Hands on head. Chapter 258. An equation referred to an equation that contained the unknown X number. It was not an advanced knowledge point, but a simple calculation tool. Solving an equation could eliminate the difficulty of reverse thinking and directly list the equation that contained the quantity to be solved. For the application of basic equations, the most popular was solving the chicken and the rabbit in the same cage problem. Dake quickly explained what he knew, and Professor Lily instantly understood. She quickly said, "A similar method is mentioned in the narrow scripture, but it was not integrated into a system. Using this method can indeed simplify the calculation. Although I don't need it. Can you go deeper? Tell me more?" Dake curiously asked. "What is the narrow scripture? Professor Lily, it's an ancient religion that worships geometry. It's probably turned into ashes by now." Dake's mouth twitched. "Does it teach mathematics?" Then he followed Professor Lily's request and went deeper. "There are many forms of equations. What I just talked about is only a linear equation. In addition, there are also linear equations of 2 variables, quadratic equations of 1 variable, and so on. You can also form equations to solve multiple unknowns. When talking about quadratic equations with one element, one had to talk about powers, which were also known as powers. With the definition of powers, one had to talk about bases, exponents, derivation." Dake spoke smoothly, and Professor Lily listened carefully. A basic mathematical model gradually took shape in the exchange between the two. The more Professor Lily talked, the more shocked she became. When she introduced the concept of powers, she discovered some extremely complicated calculations. After using powers, it was like a straight path was suddenly folded, making the chi point and the end point suddenly close together. Obviously, this was a concept that was far beyond addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Professor Lily originally only wanted to get an algorithm like the vertical calculation from Dake, but she did not expect to get something even more amazing. She thought carefully and suddenly took out a pen and paper from the drawer. She wrote a variety of complicated problems out of thin air. Then she introduced the concept of powers and used equations to solve them. The whole idea was as smooth as silk. It was unbelievable. Empty. She raised her head with a rosy face, only to find that there was no one on the sofa. In order to not go to the magic history class in the afternoon hungry, Dake chose to stop halfway and yo-yoed. Dake was actually a little envious of Professor Lily's ability to infer many things from one example. Maybe this was a real genius. He went to the cafeteria and ordered steak and meat pie. He quickly ate in the empty cafeteria and then hurried to the magic history class. When he entered through the back door, the classroom was already full of people. As usual, White and Luo 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 O O O O Luo Luo. Luo 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 O O O Luo 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 O O Luo 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 O O Luo 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 O Luo 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 O O Luo O. Robert, however, did not have such misgivings. He asked on the spot, "Hey Dark, where did you go? I've only just arrived." Dake turned his head and smiled. "I discussed some issues with Professor Lily." Luo boat. "Oh." White couldn't help but ask, "Is it related to the class this morning?" "That's right." Dake nodded and continued forward. Soon he returned to his seat. Not long after, the bell for class rang. Professor of the History of Magic, Ryan Harks, walked in on crutches. He was still wearing a broken prosthetic limb and limping as he walked, but the expression between his eyebrows and his entire temperament was very different from when he first arrived. It had only been a week of school life, but he had already shed off the thick aura of death, and some firmness had also returned between his brows. But what attracted the students the most was his almost bald head. It had grown out. "Professor." A student in the front row couldn't help but raise his hand. "Your hair?" Professor Ryan Harks raised his intact hand and pushed back his dark brown bangs. He was slightly proud of himself. "Theodore, you need to learn what it means to be polite again." "Okay, Professor," Theodore muttered as he sat down. Professor Harks then said, "I'm just doing an experiment with Sister Kalien." "Oh, she calls it a hair growth potion. So it's a lab rat." Dake blinked in the last row. He felt that Professor Harks shouldn't be happy too early. If the hair growth potion could be developed so easily, then there wouldn't be so many baldies among the nobles. However, with his thick brown hair, after shaving off his beard, Professor Hex really did look like a handsome old man. After Professor Harks walked up to the podium, he continued from the previous class, and continued to talk about the unfinished story of the war. Unfortunately, when the Golden Generation led by Hero and the others were active on the battlefield, Professor Harks had already retired due to injury. Although he had a detailed understanding of the battles that he didn't personally participate in, he still lacked some details. So he talked more about the early battles. At that time, humans had no advantage and had to pay a heavy price for every victory, but the significance of every victory was unprecedented. However, Professor Harks had talked about the victorious battles in the last two classes. In this class, he seemed to have changed his mind. 15 minutes after the class started, Professor Harks said, "Only with victory and defeat is war. We gain experience from victory and learn from defeat. The so-called history of war is also a history of sacrifice. I will always remember my comrades who sacrificed themselves, and I will never forgive those who betrayed us in the war." He seemed to have thought of something and quickly covered his mouth with a fist. He then calmed himself down and continued, "The Ghost Ox Tribe Defense War. That was a tragedy in modern war history. It was a tragic battle that almost broke the 100 Races Alliance." The students in the audience couldn't help but pay attention. Professor Harks always had a strong personal emotion when he lectured, but that was even more attractive. Even Dake couldn't help but listen. The Ghost Ox Tribe Defense War was a battle that happened in the early days of the 100 Races Alliance Treaty. The Ghost Ox Tribe of the Orc Tribe asked the Alliance for help at that time. After an emergency discussion, the Alliance immediately treated that as a crucial battle that symbolized the Alliance. Thus, they sent an Alliance army composed of the orcs, elves, dwarves, and humans to the Ghost Ox Tribe to rescue them. And Professor Harks was among them. Chapter 259. The Ghost Ox Tribe is located between the mountain walls on both sides, and there are only 2 roads available. The tribe environment is dark. The thick fog does not disperse the lack of light, everyone's skin is pale, even the horns are colorless, Only a pair of eyes are dark and deep. Even the pupils are black like the eyes of the evil ghost. The Alliance army rushed to support, just met the demon cultivator team that attacked the Ghost Ox tribe, and killed it after a fierce battle. With the ready-made results, the momentum of the Alliance army was more and more prosperous, and they were warmly entertained in the Ghost Ox tribe. For a time, singing and dancing jubilant. But when they were resting, they did not forget to understand the situation, and immediately joined the militia of the Ghost Ox tribe to set up sentry posts and increase defensive fortifications. Ryan Hux was the deputy commander of the temporary Alliance military section at that time, which was also a real power figure. After that, the Demon Cultivator army attacked again and again. Although they were powerful, they were repelled by the Alliance army. The cooperation between the parties gradually became smoother and showed the joint effect. Until half a month later, on the night of the full moon, the accident happened. Because of the good cooperation of all ethnic groups in the campaign in this half-month, the local warriors of the Ghost Ox tribe also showed the brave side of fighting and not afraid of sacrifice, so the Alliance army gradually relaxed their internal vigilance. But I didn't expect that when the Demon Cultivator attacked, the 4 commanders of the Alliance army were all poisoned, and no one was spared. Remember the URL, MVIP, can't you? 6 At that time, the Alliance was just formed, strength was respected, and the 4 commanders were also strong generals in the army. They were poisoned and unable to participate in the war, so the strength of the Alliance army was greatly reduced. Internally, they were suspicious of each other and quarreled fiercely. Everyone was a mole. Not to mention any cooperation. A bloody battle opened in an extremely unfavorable situation. That night, the mountain walls on both sides were smashed, and the thick fog of the Ghost Ox tribe was completely dispelled. The entire tribe was almost dyed red with blood. The Demon Cultivator army took the upper hand and slaughtered wildly until dawn. Both the Ghost Ox tribe and the Alliance army suffered heavy casualties, and the bones piled up into mountains. Among the 4 commanders who were poisoned, the Dwarf commander and the Orc commander joined the battle in order to protect their subordinates and died in grief and indignation. The Human commander and the Elf commander survived under the protection of their subordinates. The whole canyon is full of death. The chief of the Ghost Ox tribe suddenly let out a sorrowful cry. The entire Ghost Bull tribe was wiped out in the bloody battle that night. Even the old, the weak, the women and the children were not spared. Only a dozen or so people were left. His position as the chief only existed in name. The defense of the Ghost Ox tribe had failed. However, the Alliance army, which had suffered heavy casualties, had no time to care about him. The remnants of the 4 races were scattered in 4 corners, licking their wounds in grief. After resting for a while, anger welled up in his heart. The poisoning of the 4 commanders at the same time was definitely not the work of an outsider. They quickly recalled the high-level meeting last night. The 4 commanders would only appear at the same time during the daily meeting. The Ghost Ox tribe's chief and 4 vice commanders were also present. However, the 4 deputy commanders all stood behind the commander and did not have a seat. The only person sitting at the same table as the 4 commanders was the Ghost Ox chieftain, to be able to poison the drinking water. Thinking of this, the Orc vice commander suddenly stood up, but when he saw the Ghost Bull chieftain crying while hugging his head, he hesitated. The rest of the people were the same. They really could not think of a reason for the Ghost Ox chieftain to poison the water, because his people were almost completely slaughtered in the bloody battle last night. Since they could not find the traitor, there was no point in staying here. They did not dare to rest for too long. When the sun rose above their heads, they dragged their broken bodies and fled the Ghost Ox tribe. In order to not be followed, they took many measures. However, when the next night came, the Ghost Ox chieftain held the head of the Elven commander and appeared in front of everyone. Countless demons appeared behind him and launched a fatal attack on the remnants of the Alliance army. In that battle, there were less than 10 people who escaped. Professor Ryan Hex was one of the survivors, but he also lost an eye in that battle. He reached out to touch his right eye with the black eye patch, only to feel that the eye that had healed for many years was once again in pain. The failure of the defense of the Ghost Ox tribe was a huge blow to the newly formed alliance, especially the Orc side, which was questioned by the 100 races. Ormundo Zacharias, I wish I could pull out his bones and tear his tendons, and swallow him alive. Professor Hex fiercely spat out a mouthful of anger. At this time, a noble student suddenly raised his hand and asked, Professor, since the Ghost Ox chieftain is a traitor, has he not been caught yet? Professor Hex said with a gloomy face, I can only say that he has been caught before. Okay, today's class is over. When you go back, pick a famous traitor in history, and write a small evaluation paper. Hand it in before the next class. The atmosphere of the classroom that had become serious with Professor Hex's speech became serious again in another sense. Ding-ling-ling. The bell rang for the end of class. Professor Hex dragged his heavy footsteps and limped out of the classroom. The students immediately became rowdy. Luo Si turned around and asked, Dake, what does the professor mean by being caught before? Dake's eyelashes drooped and he said, he probably means that he has escaped from prison. He could not help but think of what the great sage Daly mentioned, the war criminal that escaped from Badia prison. It can't be that coincidental, right? Deanna was shocked. Such a bad guy, did he really escape? Dake said lightly, I don't know. But according to what Professor Hex said, even if Ormundo Zacharias is still alive, he should be an old man with broken teeth. There's no need to be too scared. Deanna. I'm not scared. Dake smiled and picked up his bag. Let's go to the library. He already had an idea for today's magic history homework. In the Great Sage Daily on the weekend, the war criminal that occupied the entire page was also a traitor. He was going to look up the relevant newspapers and magazines, research the traitor's information, and write a related evaluation. Olivia Copernicus, that was her name. It was said that she was a mixed-blood demon born in the human society. Compared to Ormundo Zacharias, who betrayed the alliance by sacrificing his entire tribe, Olivia Copernicus had a good reason on the surface. After all, there was still a small portion of demon blood in her veins. Among the factors that attracted Dake to her, there was also the part of her family name. Chapter 260. Nikolai Copernicus was a Polish astronomer, mathematician, doctor of canon law, and priest during the Renaissance. He was also the creator of the heliocentric theory, and the pioneer of modern astronomy. Of course, he was not from this world. Dake only paid more attention to Olivia Copernicus because of her familiar name. Professor Hex happened to be giving out an assignment to study the traitors and remembered her. There was a wanted poster for Olivia Copernicus in that issue of the Daily Sage, but it was more than 10 years ago. Since she could be recognized so easily, her appearance should not have changed much over the past 10 years. He had a name, a face, and the time when the wanted poster was published. The scope of the search was instantly narrowed down to an acceptable level. Dake, Deanna, and Luo Si went to the library together. It took them about 2 hours to find a thick stack of information. There were newspapers, magazines, and some related historical documents. Olivia was not a well-known figure among the traitors. Remember, https://m. VIP can't you? VIP after all, the nature of her betrayal was not quite the same as that of Ormundo Zacharias, the chief of the Ghost Bull tribe. There was no typical example of a traitor. She was classified as a traitor simply because she had human blood flowing in her veins. Later on, she became a minion of the demons. Therefore, it was not easy to find information about her. Most of the students looked for well-known traitors. There were specific examples to be traced back to, and even ready-made evaluations to be used as reference. Deanna and Luo Si both chose similar traitors. They finished their homework faster than Dake. However, Dake was not in a hurry. If he only did the homework to complete the task, then the homework itself would be much less meaningful. Dake spent the whole night before he had a more detailed understanding of the mixed blood demon. What surprised him was that the wanted poster for Olivia Copernicus suddenly appeared at the end of the war. A large number of people labeled as traitors appeared at the same time as her. However, Dake did a little research on the past of some of the others. He found that Olivia was the only one who did not have any records of her past. Or perhaps her past had been deliberately cut off. This made her seem like a person who appeared out of thin air. The wanted poster was her resume when she first introduced herself to the world. Her crime was the unified crime of betrayal. At the end of the war, when the humans were on the verge of final victory, a large number of people were being purged, and she was likely to be one of them. However, in the process of her escape, she displayed a very strong combat ability. Whether it was the bounty hunters or the heresy inquisitors of the Holy Church, they all returned in defeat. After a long time, she suddenly disappeared without a trace. When she reappeared, she had turned herself in. Yes. This traitor suddenly appeared in the Church of the Holy Church late one night. She made a sincere confession to the Holy Church and allowed the Holy Knights to arrest her. This incident was even publicized by busybodies. The Holy Church added fuel to the fire and spread a wave of doctrines. After that, Olivia went through a public trial by the Heresy Inquisition and was sentenced to 100 years in prison. She was imprisoned in the Badia prison. Dake found a newspaper. There was a high-definition color picture of her in a prison uniform. Her feet were shackled as she was sent to the prison gate. Olivia had beautiful wine-red hair. Her skin was slightly pale, but her facial features were delicate. She was about 30 years old. She looked like a ripe peach. In order to show her ferociousness, the color picture had drawn her fangs very clearly. Obviously, the blood of the demons flowing in her body belonged to the vampires. How is this possible? Dake was very surprised when he found out about this. After his encounter with Vlad in the secret room, he had done some research on vampires. The bloodline of vampires was very aggressive. Their inheritance could be roughly divided into two ways. The first way was through the embrace. A human would be turned into a blood thrall. From the blood thrall, the blood would be purified step by step to become a true vampire. The other way was through biological inheritance. No matter what species, after breeding with a vampire, the offspring could only be vampires. Their bloodline might be degraded and become impure. However, they would only be low-level vampires. There was nothing else. Legend had it that after a god and a vampire bred, the offspring would also be vampires. That god was even exiled because of this. Therefore, in theory, the hybrid of humans and vampires did not exist. However, if Olivia was a complete vampire, she could only be sentenced to death. She could not be imprisoned. This was obviously contradictory. Unless Olivia had a special power that could resist the corrosion of the bloodline. Dake tapped the tip of his pen on the notebook and turned it slightly, thinking about the possibilities. He had a vague feeling that there was something he should know, but he could not remember it. After a long while, he got up and went into the dessert room to eat something. When he came out again, he had given up on pursuing this point. After that, he began to write a related thesis. The thesis was a little strange. It was about whether Olivia had betrayed him. A vampire, powerhouse who had no record of actively killing humans. A betrayer, who had voluntarily gone to the church to repent and turn herself in. So, where had she betrayed him? Dake could not find any information about Olivia's betrayal. Therefore, he needed someone to tell him. This feeling of watching a melon being eaten halfway, and then suddenly disappearing was not a good feeling. After completing his homework, Dake returned to the dormitory. He thought about it carefully. Between pride, bliss, and greed, he chose greed. He then drew it out and stored it well. Then he used 3 flower cards and lowered the index of bliss by 3 points as insurance. The purpose of drawing greed was to cultivate a magical fairy with the core of fruit of greed. After everything was settled, he took out pride 3 and used it on the little demon. This time, the evolution of the little demon was very smooth. It did not stay in the intermediate state. It directly evolved into a demon based on its memory. There was no need for pride eye to guide it. As expected, Dake's thoughts moved slightly. He took the opportunity to practice teleportation with the demon a few times. This was to ensure that he was not proficient enough in using it at critical moments. After that, he communicated with Ibuchan and asked it to prepare for tomorrow night's listening in. After 3 months, the astronomy class finally started again. Chapter 261. Early in the evening, The first-year students had received the notice that the astronomy class had started. It had caused quite a stir in the library at that time. When humans were children, they always yearned for the stars. Curling up in the arms of their parents, looking up at the starry night sky, counting the bright stars with a childish voice, they would feel a faint sense of happiness. But as they grew older, the stars would become more and more unreachable. There was a saying in the circle of astrologers. Children could see the stars in their eyes. Once they grew up, they lost their potential. If they couldn't learn astrology when they were children, they would never be able to learn astrology when they reached adulthood. The first-year students were actually very interested in astronomy, especially after Professor Didi's astronomy class. Their interest was aroused, and then they were absent for 3 whole months. The first website was https://m.vip, so they showed great interest in the astronomy class that was suddenly reopened. In fact, a few days ago, there was a rumor that there would be a new astronomy professor. The junior magisters had been secretly looking forward to it for a long time. The next day was Wednesday. It was nightfall. At 7 o'clock, the 12th floor of the spiral clock tower was already full of people. There was still half an hour before the class started at 7:30, but the students had learned their lesson from the first class, and most of them chose to come early. People like White and Luoboat, who had been late to class and had their marks deducted, came earlier than anyone else. But the new professor didn't sit in the classroom early like Professor Didi. When the students didn't see the new professor, they couldn't help but talk about it. Some people were guessing who the new professor would be. Some people were thinking about what would be taught tonight. Would the new professor have a good temper? Would he randomly deduct marks? Would the content be interesting? How would it compare to Professor Didi's? At the end of the last astronomy class, Professor Didi showed the students the full moon at a very close distance, which shocked them for a long time. He wondered what kind of surprise this new professor would bring to him. Dake arrived at the classroom around 7:15. As soon as he entered, he saw Diana waving at him, so he walked over and sat down in the seat behind the two of them. "Dake, have you met the new professor?" Diana asked excitedly. Dake shook his head. "Not yet. However, the professors hired by the academy couldn't be bad. At least on a level." "Diana, that's true. I hope that the new professor's lecture will be more interesting and simple. Don't be too difficult." Dake smiled and took out a notebook and a pen from his bag. He then placed a small holder on the table and took out a magic card. The little Ibu on the card was looking around with wide eyes, full of curiosity. Dake placed it on the stand facing the blackboard. Diana was puzzled. "What are you doing?" Dake pointed at Ibuzachan and said, "It's interested in astronomy." "Oh." Diana nodded as if she understood. After she turned back, she suddenly tore out a piece of paper from her notebook and folded it into a tripod. She then carefully picked out 2 cards from the deck and copied Dake and placed them on the stand. Luosi, who was sitting at the same table, couldn't help but cover her mouth and laugh. Dake opened his mouth but couldn't say anything for a while. Those 2 magic cards should be the Bear of the Earth and the Bear of the Spirit, right? Neither lonely nor lonely. The clock on the wall above the podium suddenly spat out a cuckoo bird. The students stared blankly for a moment before realizing that it was already 7:30. But where was the new professor? Is he late for the first class? Dake gathered magic at his fingertips and scratched Ibuzachan's chin, making it blush. The noise in the classroom dropped a little when it was time for class, but then it became noisier than before. The new professor's tardiness surprised and puzzled the students. It wasn't that no professor had ever been late, and some professors were even late by a minute or 2. But this was the first class, so shouldn't they show some attitude? Luoboat complained. "If I had known, I wouldn't have come so early." White said, "Could there be something urgent?" Luoboat said, "No way." Time went by little, and the students' patience was wearing thin. After a full 5 minutes, the ceiling of the classroom suddenly became transparent, just like when Professor Didi was in class. But the distance between their line of sight and the night sky didn't close. What appeared in their field of vision was a pumpkin carriage that looked like it had come out of a fairy tale. Although it was called a carriage, it wasn't pulled by horses, but by 2 dark, indistinct beasts. There was a golden road that snaked out from under the wheels of the pumpkin carriage, all the way to the classroom. The ceiling suddenly split in two. The pumpkin carriage followed the path and flew all the way down. Amidst the cries of the students, it entered the classroom and flew to the edge of the podium. As the pumpkin carriage came to a stop, a witch dressed in dark purple opened the curtains and walked out of the carriage. Everyone's heart trembled. Midya Bartholomew lifted her long legs that were tightly wrapped in purple stockings and stepped down from the carriage. Thump! Her sharp high heels made a sound as they touched the ground. Midya took off her witch hat and shook her head slightly. Her long black hair that was tinged with purple fell over her shoulders like a waterfall, and a rich fragrance spread out. Her mature womanly charm made the boys in the front row blush. She grabbed the brim of her hat and waved it out. The pumpkin carriage suddenly turned into billowing black smoke and drilled into the hat. She then took out a chopstick-thin wand from her witch hat and pointed it at the witch hat. The witch hat suddenly burst open and disappeared with a bang sound. Wow. Everyone cried out in surprise. Where is the magic? Dake couldn't help but facepalm. He didn't have a good impression of this new professor. He always felt that she was too charming. However, the little magisters seemed to like this scene. They even ignored her late arrival. Deanna was still clapping with all her might. She was so excited that her face was red. I want to pinch it. After a while, Midya seemed to have enjoyed enough of the students' compliments. She finally raised her hand and pressed it down. When the classroom quieted down a little, she began to formally introduce herself. I think you should have already guessed that I am this semester's substitute astronomy professor, the guide of fate, the diviner of the eyes of the stars, and the witch of the silver moon, Midya Bartholomew. The guide of fate, the diviner of the eyes of the stars, the witch of the silver moon. When these three titles were put out, it gave people a kind of unconsciously bright feeling. Although the little magisters didn't quite understand, they still clapped with all their might. The atmosphere of the meeting continued to change. The corner of Midya's mouth slightly raised, revealing a trace of pride. Sure enough, when you are lonely, you should come out for a walk. The Star Tower was too deserted. After all, Midya was here to teach, not to perform. After her self-introduction, she walked to the podium and took out a roll call. She smiled and said, "Now it is my turn to get to know you. The students whose names are called, please stand up. If possible, it is best to briefly introduce yourself so that I can better understand you." Then the first one, Aima Métis. Aima was stunned. She remembered that her name was not first on the roll call. But since Professor Midya Bartholomew had called her, she had no choice but to stand up. "Is this Miss Métis?" Midya nodded and asked. "I heard that you are the disciple of the Sage of Secrets." Aima was stunned again. Then she shook her head and said, "No. Although my mother is the student of the Sage of Secrets, the Sage of Secrets has many students. She is only one of them. I have nothing to do with her." Midya narrowed her eyes slightly and carefully sized her up. Then she suddenly burst out with a sentence. "Your throne stands on the golden earth." Aima blinked. What did she mean by that? Midya had already skipped over her and called the second name. Every time she called a name, she would give a sentence. The student asked her if it was a prophecy, but she shook her head and denied it. Saraswati. Here. Sarah put down her pen and stood up. She was very interested in the new professor's prophecy. She first introduced herself with a sentence, "Hello, Professor. I am an aspiring archaeologist who seeks knowledge." Midya said, "Very good ambition. Look forward to drinking with the ancient gods above the river Styx." Sarah rolled her eyes and said, "Professor, I am still young." Midya was stunned for a moment. Then she smiled and said, "I am not cursing you." "That's good." Sarah touched her little heart and sat down. "Teddy Dolan." Here. Dolan suddenly stood up. He was very interested in the words of this so-called diviner professor. He wanted to know what his prophecy was. Professor Midya Bartholomew smiled at him. After 3 seconds, Dolan came back to his senses and quickly said, "The wall of the kingdom, House of Dolan, House of Nobles, gentlemen." "Okay, my little gentleman," Midya said with a smile. "Time will heal the wounds." "Ah." Dolan's excitement disappeared in an instant. Professor, what does this mean? Midya comforted him. Don't worry too much. People will always experience trauma in their life. As I said, this is not a prophecy. Dolan. Then why did you say it? Dolan sat down with a heavy heart. Luosi Flotty. Yes, Professor. Luosi stood up under Deanna's envious gaze. She thought for a while and whispered, Hello, Professor, I have an orange catgrass. Midya's expression changed slightly. She carefully looked at her. Her pupils were slightly dilated, and there was a reflection of the silver moon. She opened her mouth and said in a distant and hollow voice, Above the stars, thy home. Luosi's mouth was half open. Professor, I'm just an ordinary. Midya waved her hand and smiled. No one is ordinary. Remember my words, great people are born great. Luosi sat down in confusion, but she still copied the 2 sentences of Professor Midya. Although Professor Midya repeatedly stated that what she said was not a prophecy, the more she said it, the more it felt like she was trying to cover it up. It made people feel that what she said was a prophecy. Maybe this was a kind of speech technique. Or maybe she was just telling the truth. Who knows? Since ancient times, prophets, whether they were the real deal or swindlers, always liked to use some exaggerated and false words to modify their prophecies. Of course, there were necessary reasons, but it did make the prophecies less credible, and it also allowed some people to pass off fish eyes as pearls. Professor Midya's prophecies were obviously the same. She would always use some high-end words. For example, throne, ancient gods, time, stars. But if one analyzed it in depth, they might be able to analyze something completely different from the literal meaning. But in the current situation, the little magus did not think too much about it. They were not surprised by the high-end words in Ai Ma and Sarah's prophecies, but they did not expect that Luosi, who was unremarkable in all aspects, would receive such a high evaluation. Above the stars, great people. These words, were they really used to describe her? Many students could not help but look back at her with all kinds of thoughts in their eyes. But Luosi herself was also confused, and even a little helpless. She subconsciously grabbed Deanna's hand, and only then did she calm down. Deanna Gretbel. At this time, Professor Midya called out Deanna's name. Deanna wanted to hear what her prophecy was, but when she saw that Luosi was troubled by the prophecy, she was a little unhappy. She pouted and said, I am Deanna. I like bears and I want to be a hero. My idol is the Valkyrie. Professor Midya nodded slightly and said, Your name will be engraved on the Monument of Heroes. What was a Monument of Heroes? It was an existence that became a legend after one's great achievements, and a hero who had become the object of worship after one's death. In other words, she would eventually become a hero. Professor Midya's straightforward prophecy made the students shift their attention once again. Most of their gazes fell on Diana. Among them, White's gaze was the most fervent, because Deanna's goal was very similar to his. To become a hero. To become a true warrior. This was his wish after he found out that he was the son of a hero. How he wished that Professor Midya could say the same prophecy to him. Interesting. Dake put down his pen and looked at the full page of names and prophecies written on it. Starting from Ai Ma. He wrote down every prophecy that Professor Midya said. Even though he felt that Professor Midya's prophecies were not reliable. After all, no prophet could give so many prophecies at once. Divination and fortune-telling all came with a price. But this did not stop him from having fun. 2 in 1, 4,000 words. Chapter 262. Luobot Broheim. Yes, Professor. Luobot hurriedly stood up. He was a little nervous. It was just like going to the shrine to draw lots. Everyone knew that the good or bad luck of the draw depended on luck, not fate. But still, many people cared about it. As more and more people drew G, more and more people would pay attention to it. Luobot didn't want to get any bad omens. He stood up straight and said, I am Luobot. I like magic chess. In the future, I want to be a soldier. Professor Midya looked at him and suddenly stopped talking. After a long while, he opened his mouth to speak. This sudden pause gave Luobot a bad premonition. Professor Midya said, "Your fate, the fate of the chess piece. If the chess piece breaks, the person dies." Luobot's legs went soft, and he sat down with a bang. "Remember the URL, VIP, can't you?" The loud noise attracted the attention of the entire class. White quickly stood up and asked, "Professor, is this a bad omen?" Professor Midya's expression was calm. He smiled and said, "Looking at the essence from the surface is the core of a prophecy. In astrology, death isn't just the end, it's also the beginning. Even from the word death, one could read life. My words today don't have any meaning. Don't take it to heart." He meant, "I'm just talking nonsense. Don't read too much into it." But for the little magi, it didn't matter whether the content was true or false. If you got a bad omen, it was definitely bad luck. This was a fact that couldn't be avoided. It was also commonly known as an unlucky person. Doran couldn't help but look at him with pity. Luobot was surrounded by sympathetic gazes. He was scared. Seeing this scene, Dark recorded the prophecy about him and pondered, "It's a prophecy." Professor Midya's prophecy seemed to be a bad omen. But life was like a game of chess. Everyone was a chess piece. And everyone would eventually die. Wasn't it just a case of the chess piece breaking and the person dying? Was this thing a prophecy or not? If that was the case, then wouldn't everyone be a prophet? White Gouda. Before White could sit down, Professor Midya had already called out his name. White's body trembled, and his face tightened subconsciously. He thought for a while and said, "Professor, I'm a first-year student at the Knights Academy. If I have to pick one thing that I like, magic chess should be one of them. My future goal is to become a hero, just like my father." Professor Midya nodded. "Brett, God is your father, right?" White, "Yes." The silver moon in the depths of Midya's eyes gradually became plentiful, and her voice became a little ethereal. "History is always the same, the cycle never stops." White, "What does that mean?" Midya smiled and said, "Each has its own interpretation." White sat down in confusion. After a while he asked Luobot, "Is she saying that I will follow the path that my father walked?" Luobot was still crying. "Then isn't it broken?" White was confused. "Why?" Luobot casually said, "Didn't your father sacrifice himself?" White, "After all, the identity of the hero was different." Professor Midya's prophecy, to White, obviously caused a wave of commotion, and it quietly spread among the crowd. The way they looked at White changed again. "History is always the same, the cycle never stops." "Professor Midya, are you saying that White will become a hero?" Deanna was surprisingly smart for once, and she turned to Dake and whispered. Dake smiled and said, "Maybe." After all, White was indeed the protagonist in the original work. If the path of fate was not changed, then he would definitely become a hero. Although Dake couldn't see it for the time being, White probably also had the potential to become a hero. As for what the future path would be, no one could say for sure. Even the prophets were divided into two factions. One faction was a one-way view. They believed that the path of the future was one way, and everything was fixed. They could only slowly move forward according to the path of fate, and it couldn't be changed. The so-called prophets were just observers of the path of fate. The other faction was a multi-way view. They believed that the path of the future was multi-way, and it was uncertain. What the prophets could observe was only a fragment of one of the lines. And from the moment they observed that fragment, the world line had already changed. Therefore, this faction believed that the prophets were independent of the world line, and they were great and noble. The former was more approachable. The latter was more arrogant. The former had a longer lifespan. The latter had a shorter lifespan. This was more or less the classification. Although Dake wasn't a prophet, he clearly favored the latter faction. He also believed that ever since he observed a part of the future, fate had changed. Everything was still uncertain. On the podium, Professor Midya took in the children's expressions and whispers. She knew that this batch of students was special. The children of the hero, the children of the Valkyrie. The continuation of the bloodline of the Golden Generation was extremely attractive to prophets. A large number of prophets, both real and fake, had made predictions about this batch of students. Some of the conclusions were similar, while some were completely opposite. But that was how prophecies were. Even if they observed some elements of the future, they still needed to make a precise interpretation of those elements. And the same element, in the eyes of different prophets, would often appear to be completely different. Therefore, before they received concrete evidence of the future, no one could know if their own prophecy was correct, let alone someone else's prophecy. The Tower Master of the Star Tower had once tried to add probability theory into divination, but the calculation of probability was too complicated. They lacked a proper model, so in the end, they could only make superficial predictions. Midya was the astrologer on the Star Tower. The real purpose of her accepting Eardiai's invitation to substitute for the class was to observe this batch of students closely to interpret a prophecy. A prophecy about the stars, the black fog, and the abyss. Eudora envy. Yes, yes. The girl with a pink doll head quickly stood up and lowered her head in fear. Midya's eyes flashed slightly and she said, "Be brave and raise your head." Eudora raised her head, and her big eyes with extremely long eyelashes flickered slightly. But when she met Midya's eyes, Eudora was suddenly stunned. Stars actually appeared in the depths of her eyes. It was competing with the silver moon in the depths of Midya's eyes. At this moment, Midya's face suddenly revealed a look of ecstasy. She didn't expect that there was such a talent hidden among this batch of students. Eyes of stars. People with eyes of stars could see through the trajectory of the stars and use it to spy on fate. Every person with eyes of stars was a natural astrologer. If she could accept Eudora as her disciple, even if she couldn't successfully interpret the prophecy, it would be a worthwhile trip. But in this classroom, she obviously shouldn't be so anxious. Midya quickly restrained her expression and said softly, "Don't you want to introduce yourself?" "Me." Eudora hesitated for a while and said, "I'm Eudora. I like the starry sky, and my dream is to become a bride." Midya was slightly startled, then she sighed, "Not a bad dream. Your eyes contain stars, and the night will bless you." There were not many astrologers who were married. Eudora looked slightly happy and she said loudly, "Thank you." Time passed by bit. Dake was thinking that this astronomy class would probably be spent in self-introduction and prophecy, when he heard his name. Dake Dimong. He stood up calmly, looked up at Midya, and began to introduce himself casually. "Hello, Professor. I'm Dake Dimong. I don't have many hobbies, and I don't have much ambition. Well, if I have to choose one, then I like cats. After graduation, I hope to inherit the family business. Relieve the worries of the future, inherit the title of Duke, get billions of wealth, play with cats, eat melons, carry on the family line, and just wait for death." Well, this was Dake Dimong's current dream. After he finished speaking, he faced the surrounding gazes calmly, waiting for Midya's prophecy. But Midya was almost blinded when she looked at it slightly. She quickly looked away with lingering fear in her heart. This wasn't the first time she was flashed. From the moment she entered this classroom, she couldn't help but look at that corner several times. And every time she looked, she was flashed once. That pair of eyes of the silver moon was almost blinded. Before this, I've never heard that the son of the Valkyrie is actually the son of the stars. Midya couldn't help but curse in her heart. The moon was also one of the stars. Midya's eyes of the silver moon was the same as Eudora's eyes of the stars. They were both a type of eyes of the stars. But her eyes of the silver moon were obviously more mature, and she could see more deeply. In her vision, Dake was simply an amalgamation of stars. The blazing sun, the gentle moon, the huge Saturn, the shining Venus, the restless Jupiter. Stars of all sizes gathered together, forming a resplendent star chart. In historical records, people who had such a vision were called sons of the stars. It was said that they could borrow the power of the stars to cause miracles. The first time she saw Dake, she thought that he should be the key to interpreting the prophecy that she was looking for. But soon after, she discovered even more great people in this classroom. Thus, the scope of the stars was expanded to include multiple students. She closed her eyes and let the silver moon hide. Then she opened her eyes and looked at the sons of the stars. Midya said in her unique voice, Don't hesitate, don't doubt. Embracing the stars is embracing everything. Dake was stunned. Professor Midya's prophecy surprised him. He was even a little scared. He slowly sat down. Then he realized that he might be thinking too much. As long as he continued to walk down his path, some future paths would not exist. It was impossible for them to appear in the prophecy. There was no need to worry about it. But this new astronomy professor really seemed to be something. Unlike other prophecies that were more indicative, Dake's prophecy was actually more vague. If one didn't experience it, it would be difficult to understand the meaning. The reason why Midya said this sentence was completely different from Dake's understanding. The other students were even more confused. Some people thought that Professor Midya meant that Dake would definitely be able to inherit the Duke's billions of assets and obtain everything he wanted. And that was the life of the Duke's son. It was something that others couldn't envy. Of course, it was also a nonsensical statement. Among them, only Eudora seemed to understand the other meaning. She couldn't help but cover her hot cheeks. As for Rose, who had received the prophecy, "Thy home above the stars," she was rather sensitive to the word stars, and thought of something else from a different perspective. She couldn't help but look away. In addition, Dake's prophecy was not as impressive as the hero's son. Some people even secretly speculated. I heard that Hero Brett was not a particularly top student when he was a student. Could this be a historical similarity? White will really become a hero. Prophets always said, since ancient times, whenever a hero appeared, it was when humans needed him. If White really became a hero, did it mean that disaster would really come? All kinds of thoughts were passed in the classroom. The little magisters whispered to each other and speculated. Midya's roll call and prophecy were still going on. A few minutes before the end of the class, the entire roll call process finally ended. The process was very long, but the students didn't find it boring. Professor Midya's prophecy was very interesting. Some students who received a good prophecy even copied it and prepared to make it into an amulet or other type of jewelry when they went back. Although some students who received a bad prophecy were screaming on the surface, they didn't care too much in their hearts except for some frustration. Only a small group of people felt like a fishbone was stuck in their throat. For example, Doran and Luobot couldn't let it go. In the last few minutes, the little magisters saw that the roll call was finally over. The class would be over in a few minutes. The atmosphere was getting more and more lively. But Professor Midya suddenly waved her magic wand and drew a purple heart in the air. Then she said a little loudly, "Today is my first class. I didn't talk much." Not only didn't she talk much, she didn't talk at all. Dake, who was in the last row, couldn't help but curse. He specially brought little Ibu to listen. In the end, Ibu knew all the students in the first grade. Professor Midya continued, "I know that astronomy is only an interest class in the first grade. But since I'm here, it's no longer an interest class. We have at least a semester to spend together. During this time, I will impart some knowledge related to astrology to you. Tonight is just the beginning. I hope that after you go back, you can try to interpret the words I gave during the roll call. This will be our first class assignment. Do you understand?" "Understand my ass." The classroom exploded in an instant. Not everyone had the habit of taking notes. Some people didn't even care about it. After thinking about it for a while, they put all their attention on the prophecy of others. They hurriedly turned their heads and wanted to ask their deskmate, but they often saw the same confused expression on their deskmate's face. 2 and 1 4,200. Chapter 263. This was something that couldn't be helped. After all, this was how people's memories worked. They thought they remembered everything, but when they thought about it, there would always be 1 or 2 words that they couldn't remember. Midya looked at the rowdy students and couldn't help but smile mischievously. Then she raised her wand and tapped it lightly. A pumpkin carriage appeared out of thin air, growing from small to large, and appeared on the podium. She stepped onto the carriage and waved to the students. "See you next week." Then, the 2 beasts pulling the carriage ran a few steps forward. Then, they suddenly soared into the air and rushed out from the ceiling, quickly disappearing into the pitch-black night sky. Ding ding ding. When the bell rang, the students realized that everything was over. Professor Midya didn't leave a record of her prophecy for them. It's over. I'll remember it in 1 second. https://m. VIP can't you? VIP. The students who didn't remember their prophecy couldn't help but cry out. Those who remembered it clearly couldn't help but smile. Luosi saw Deanna's silly smile and whispered, "Nana, you didn't forget, right?" Deanna said proudly, "Of course. My name will be engraved on the Monument of Heroes. Am I right?" "It's the Monument of Heroes," Dake, who was sitting in the back row, said helplessly. Then he put away his pen and paper and stood up. "It's time to go." Looking down from the top of the spiral clock tower, the huge castle stood quietly in the darkness. The students, who were either happy or sad, walked down the spiral staircase from the 12th floor and gradually became smaller. Professor Midya's pumpkin carriage completely merged into the night sky. She poked her head out of the window and looked at the students who were like black dots on the spiral staircase. Suddenly she asked, "Do you see it?" "I see it." The voice that came from the void had a trace of joy that couldn't be concealed. It was already late at night. With the spiral clock tower as the center, the students separated into 4 thin streams and scattered in 4 directions. Dake separated from Deanna and Luosi at the entrance of the corridor and returned to the dormitory. After entering the door, he immediately summoned little Ivan. Then he loosened his collar and exhaled. No need to hesitate, no need to doubt. Embracing the stars is embracing everything. How should I interpret this sentence? He didn't know that Professor Midya had mistaken him for the son of the stars. He could only follow his own train of thought to understand. Up until now, he was very sure that the great sin was related to the stars. If he embraced the stars, he would be embracing a great sin. Did he mean that he would be able to live an ideal life after thoroughly studying the great sin? Or was it something else? Actually, there wasn't much difference. Dake smiled helplessly. Professor Midya was known as the Guide of Fate, the diviner of the eyes of the stars, and the Witch of the Silver Moon. If one were to interpret it literally, he was probably the same as Eudora, the owner of the eyes of the stars. The reason why she mentioned the stars should be the same as Eudora. She had seen the trajectories of the stars that ordinary people could not see. In that case, he would interpret it according to her meaning, and write something about the study of the stars. He would just treat it as completing his homework. It didn't take long for Dake to finish his homework, and then he began to absorb today's greed. Today was Wednesday, the 10th day of January. After today, this month's quota would be used up, and the last greed stored was 3 points. After Dake injected greed into the insect tree, he was ready to take a bath, practice underworld spiritual art for half an hour, and then sleep comfortably. In life, being able to sleep until he woke up naturally every day was more than what he could wish for. What embracing the stars, embracing everything. He might as well embrace the catnip grass. Knock, knock, knock. There was a sudden knock on the door. Dake walked out of the bathroom with his wet blonde hair, buttoned up his bathrobe, and glanced at the little devil. The little devil obediently flew to the door and opened the door with its claws. Kacha. As the bedroom door was opened, the little devil saw Luosi's slightly helpless face. The little devil was just about to report, but it suddenly remembered that it couldn't speak to the outside world, so it quickly shut its mouth. Luosi whispered, "Is Dake here?" "Yes." Dake walked over while wiping his hair with a thick towel. Luosi saw his white and tender skin that was just soaked in hot water, and her cheeks turned red. She moved aside a little and revealed half of the other person's figure. She then said, "Anita wants me to ask if you happen to record her prophecy." Dake glanced at the classmate named Anita and understood the gist of the situation. This classmate couldn't remember the prophecy, so she tried to ask Luosi, who was sitting behind her. Luosi was a nice person, and she knew that Dake had notes, so she helped to ask. "I do have a record of the prophecy. Wait a second." Dake nodded and turned back to the desk. He wrote down Anita's prophecy on a piece of paper and sent it to the door. If Luosi came alone, he would most likely invite her in for a drink. But since there was someone else, it was fine. "Classmate?" "Ah." Anita's body shook as she quickly took the paper and said happily, Thank you very much. She had accidentally stared blankly just now. Dake's classmate's skin was so good. Slurp, Luosi said helplessly. Sorry I came so late and caused you trouble. Dake smiled. It's just a small matter, good night. Luosi raised her hand and smiled sweetly. Good night. Then she left with Anita. Dake shook his head and locked the door. Then he dried his hair and sat in front of the desk. He picked out the prophecies of the aristocrats and made a copy. The prophecies about himself, Deanna, and Luosi were separated out. In the process of copying, he suddenly noticed that these prophecies were not without purpose. At first glance, they all seemed to be the same. Does a true prophet have a profound meaning behind even his casual words? In the end, Dake noticed Luobot's prophecy again. Because that prophecy was an omen of great misfortune. Your life, the chess piece's life, the chess piece breaks and the person dies. Among all these prophecies, only this one pointed to death. Previously, he had thought that this sentence was nonsense that dictated life. But now the more he looked at it, the more he felt that it was wrong. He couldn't help but be distracted. Knock, knock, knock. There was a knock on the door again. Dake picked up the prophecy form of the aristocrats and opened the door himself. Sure enough, he saw that it was Anita and 2 other students. So he pointed at the form and stuck it on the door. He smiled and said, It's all here. If you need it, you can take a look. The 2 students were delighted. Luckily we have Dake. Then I'll go to bed first. Dake locked the door again and took the time to practice underworld magic. During the half-hour of practice, people passed by the door from time to time, but they didn't disturb him. The night passed peacefully like this. The next day, Thursday, the first class in the morning was arithmetic. Dake could roughly guess that Professor Li would most likely teach something related to equations in this class. The basic equations weren't difficult and were very useful for simplifying some calculations. But for beginners, any new knowledge wasn't easy to grasp. He hoped that Professor Li would be able to make it easier to understand. But he didn't expect that he had underestimated Professor Li's bottom line. Ring, ring, ring. A little fairy flapped her dragonfly wings and entered the classroom. The first-year students suddenly looked up like lambs waiting to be fed. They looked at the math professor with a thirst for new knowledge seriously. Today we're going to learn a new subject. Professor Li smiled proudly as she waved her magic pen around. When the students were ready for battle, she suddenly stretched out her hand and pointed at Dark. Next, let's invite our substitute professor, Dake Dimeng, to come on stage and explain. Clap, 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 clap. Even though the students were surprised, it wasn't Dake's first time teaching, so most of them clapped along with the atmosphere. But while they were clapping, almost everyone couldn't help but look at the blonde boy sitting in the back of the classroom. What was the reason that caused a professor to shamelessly ask a student to substitute for him, when he didn't ask for leave? Was it the loss of morals, or the distortion of human nature? What was wrong with the world? Dake felt the focus of everyone's attention, and his expression stiffened. He had no choice but to put down the key elements of venue cards in his hand. He had originally planned to use the time of this class to learn about the zoo, but now it seemed that he had been too idealistic. Professor Li. Dake frowned and stood up. This time, he didn't follow Professor Li's instructions. Instead, he said directly, I don't think it's good to be lazy. Professor Li covered her mouth, and her cute eyes widened. She said in astonishment, What do you mean by lazy? I'm the Shungmalian's most hard-working fairy. After all, there was only one little goblin left in St. Mary's right now. Dake understood immediately, and 3 invisible black lines hung from the corners of his eyes. He then thought of the night he had spent with Professor Li, and couldn't help but feel a little soft-hearted. But Professor Li had gone a little too far by finding someone to teach in front of the students, when she had nothing important to do. Moreover, she hadn't given him any advance notice, nor had she given him any time to prepare for the class. What happened today would be the result tomorrow. If he allowed her to take an inch and take a mile, what would happen? When the time came, this arithmetic class might as well be renamed Dake Dimeng's arithmetic classroom. Therefore, this kind of behavior couldn't be tolerated. Dake said on the spot. Professor, I'm just a student. It's fine if I help occasionally. Professor Li immediately interrupted. I'm very sure that your talent in the field of arithmetic is enough to be a professor. Perhaps I should give Erdi a recommendation letter and let you become an official teaching assistant. Hey, where did you get such a great idea? Dake. Professor Li. Professor Li. I'm here. Dake. Please work harder. Professor Li. Oh, but I don't know how to do it. Dake. Please work harder. Professor Li. Okay. Professor Li seemed to finally understand Dake's good intentions, and he stopped talking back. He turned around and flew back to the podium. Dake nodded in satisfaction and sat down again. However, he didn't notice that the entire classroom was stunned after witnessing the entire conversation between him and Professor Li. Who's the professor and who's the student? Professor Li was clearly the older one, but why did Dake Dimming look more like the instructor? No, wait a minute. AI Ma, who was sitting in the first row, suddenly realized something. Didn't the professor just say that Dake Dimming is talented enough to be a professor in the field of arithmetic? Susan and Lucy, who were sitting next to her, nodded. They also heard what AI Ma said. The arithmetic class was obviously very difficult, and they had a hard time grasping the content of the class. However, there was someone in the class who received such a high evaluation. This kind of disparity made them feel uncomfortable. White couldn't help but ask Luoboat, is the gap really that big? Luoboat opened his mouth and said, let's see what Professor Li is going to teach in this class. Maybe it's not that difficult? White gulped and twirled her pen as she said, let's see. In the students' whispers, Professor Lily drew a big X on the blackboard. Today we're going to teach about the application of the unknown. She spoke faster and faster, and the classroom was dead silent. What was an unknown? What was an equation? Professor Lily used her own words to give a complete definition of these two concepts. In her opinion, these two concepts were very simple. As long as you understood the definition, you could directly apply them. However, in order to let the students understand better, she imitated Dark's explanation and gave an application question about the chicken and the rabbit in the same cage. In other words, it went from a one-dimensional equation to a two-dimensional equation. The smart AI Ma naturally wouldn't be troubled by a problem of this level. However, the stupid Deanna felt like she was listening to a heavenly book. All that was left was a buzzing sound in her head. She blinked her eyes and stared at the blackboard as she mechanically copied her notes. Luosi, who was sitting next to her, wasn't doing much better either. When people were exposed to new knowledge, they always needed a transition period. A cramming education would only have negative effects. Even though Luosi's head was hurting, he was just like Deanna. He was seriously taking notes. In short, let's copy it first. This was the secret book that Dake taught them. Clack, clack. From time to time, the sound of pens failing to spin could be heard in the classroom. Professor Li's voice was like a lullaby, lulling the nerves of the little magisters. When she wrote a new application problem on the blackboard and was about to ask someone to solve it, the lullaby suddenly turned into a thriller. Everyone woke up with a start. Chapter 264. Let's assume that there are several magisters and single-headed, four-legged magic elves in the same venue. Counting from the top, there are 35 heads. Counting from the bottom, there are 94 legs. How many magisters and magic elves are there in the venue? A simple chicken and rabbit in the same cage problem. But for the first-year students who had only been exposed to equations for an hour, it wasn't so simple. Professor Lily looked around the classroom for a long time. She felt that if she randomly asked someone to solve the problem, it might lead to some awkward situations that she didn't want to see. Thus, she didn't randomly ask someone to solve the problem. Instead, she chose AI Ma Métis. When AI Ma got up and went on stage, the students in the classroom all quietly let out a sigh of relief, as long as it wasn't them. AI Ma carefully recalled Professor Li's example problem. Although she didn't really understand it, the format of this problem was almost the same as the example problem. It wasn't difficult to imitate the example problem to solve. She quickly wrote down the answer. Correct. AI Mametis, 5 points. Professor Lily was clearly excited. She felt that she still had a talent for teaching. Didn't she only teach it once and someone already learned it? She just had to use practice questions to consolidate the problem. Website. https://m, VIP Canchu. VIP. Fortunately, she worked overtime last night to rush out a test paper. Didn't she have to use it now? Perfect. After that, she didn't ask anyone to go on stage to answer the question. Instead, she explained the problem solved by AI Ma and began to distribute the test papers. The test paper wasn't too difficult. It could be solved by self-studying according to the textbook. The scary thing was that there was no textbook. Ding ding ding. The arithmetic class came to an end with the whirling sound of the test papers. Professor Lily gave herself 9 points for today's teaching and left the classroom with satisfaction. Only numb faces were left behind. Nobody knew who was the first to scream, but the classroom was instantly filled with cries. Susan and Lucy frowned as they looked at the test paper. Then they looked at AI Ma in a fawning manner. They thought that becoming friends with AI Ma was the wisest choice they made last year. In the back row, Deanna and Luo C were also holding numerous notebooks and looking at Dake eagerly. Dake said helplessly, "Library tonight." Deanna. Okay. Luo's if you. There was a lot of pressure being around the top students. When school started, they didn't pay attention to their grades. But now they were subconsciously. On the other side, Victor and Robert were facing each other. Their faces were ashen. The AI Mas were both's AIs was worse? It is worse were? Worse? After a while, Werther said in a low voice, "Should I ask senior sister Betty?" He luo hies were? SSS. Or fortunately, he got acquainted with Betty during the exploration of the secret passage. As for Dake and Gap, he didn't even want to think about it. The introduction to magic class started, but the students were still distressed. Professor Ka Zaire pointed at a student and asked curiously, "What's going on? Why do you all look so bitter?" The student complained, "Professor, the arithmetic class is too difficult. We need guidance." "I see." Professor Ka Zaire waved his wand and asked the student to sit down. He smiled and said, "Don't worry. If you can't pass the final exam, you'll be able to attend tutoring classes next semester." The classroom suddenly became cold and cheerless. Professor Ka Zaire didn't care about the silence. He changed the topic and said, "Close your textbooks. Today we're going to teach you how to make a special magic card, the Sure Kill Skill Card." Sure Kill Skill Card? The students couldn't help but look up at the podium. Professor Ka Zaire's content had piqued their interest. There were many types of magic cards. Sure Kill Skill Cards and spell cards were only a part of them. However, compared to the more common spell cards, Sure Kill Skill Cards were only a minority. Whether it was in a real battle or a competition, very few people would use Sure Kill Skill Cards. This was because Sure Kill Skill Cards didn't have any advantages in terms of effect and refinement. However, they had more restrictions than magic cards. The vast majority of spell cards only required the magus to provide magic power to use them. However, Sure Kill Skill Cards required the summoning of the corresponding magic fairy, and the cooperation between the magus and the magus in order to use them. Moreover, based on the tacit understanding between the magus and the magic fairy, it was easy to make mistakes in cooperation. If that happened, it would be a waste. However, the magus hadn't learned the magic language and couldn't refine spell cards in the early stages. Therefore, there was no need to learn the magic language to successfully refine Sure Kill Skill Cards. This had a unique advantage. However, this thing wasn't part of the textbook. It was taught by Professor Ka Zaire personally. A few minutes later, Professor Ka Zaire gave a brief introduction to Sure Kill Skill Cards, and then began to explain in detail how to use and refine Sure Kill Skill Cards. Of course, this lesson was only about theoretical knowledge. The practical teaching could only be done next week. As for the first-year students, they had to prepare the materials for their experiments before the next introduction to magic class. They had to buy them themselves. As for the credits needed to buy the materials themselves, the poor had their ways, and the rich had their ways. If they couldn't even afford the cheapest materials, then they could only wait and see. Sure-kill skill cards? Dake thought seriously as he listened to Professor Zayer's explanation. Magic Fairy's sure-kill skill cards were usually exclusive, but there were also some systemized Magic Fairies. Some of their sure-kill skills could be used with each other. This allowed the sure-kill skill cards to have a wider range of applications. In terms of convenience, they were close to spell cards. I wonder if Pokémon are considered a system? Different Pokémon can learn the same skills. Can the sure-kill skill cards that are refined with this as the foundation be used? For example, the skill Vocal Rotation. Whether it's Fairy Ibu or Chiociosi Lion, they can all learn it. And Vocal Rotation has a continuous effect. There are a lot of factors that need to be considered to refine this sure-kill skill card, and the difficulty of refining it is also very high. Moreover, it's not like you can refine this skill just because you want to. Listening to the end, Dake gradually understood. No wonder the method of refining sure-kill skill cards was not recorded in the textbooks. It turned out that it was not a mature system. It was a new technology that was still being developed. It was only because their professor was Zayer that they had the opportunity to learn the relevant knowledge. This part of the knowledge could be regarded as a unique technique taught by Zayer. It was very valuable. Therefore, when he copied the notes, he was even more serious. The introduction to magic class ended quickly. The students who knew how precious knowledge was could only hate that time passed too quickly. The students who were drowsy from listening to the lecture wished they could run out immediately. Lunchtime. The students gradually put the homework and the purchase of experimental materials to the back of their minds. They talked about the history of magic class in the afternoon, the interpretation of prophecies, and the newcomers' competition on Saturday. After eating and drinking their fill, they took a short nap. Before they knew it, it was already afternoon. The students hurriedly picked up their backpacks and ran to the classroom. They rushed into the history of magic class before 2 o'clock. Professor Ryan Hex seemed to have undergone a certain degree of self-reflection after his emotional state in the last class. In this afternoon's history of magic class, he talked about some interesting things during the war journey, which brought some laughter. At the end of the history of magic class, he collected the homework about the betrayer from the last class and gave new homework. The class was considered to be over. I hope Professor Hex can answer my doubts. Dake could not help but think as he handed in his homework. That night, a large number of first-year students poured into the library. Everyone was biting on their pens, trying to solve the difficult problem in the arithmetic class. But for them who had never come into contact with this kind of knowledge, that test paper was really too difficult. In order to find the answer, they had no choice but to stand up and ask around. The discussions between each other gradually became uncontrollable. The silence in the reading room was broken, and it finally attracted the scolding of Miss Bella. The angry Miss Bella directly drove all the first-year students out of the library. The upperclassmen looked at the disheveled first-year students and laughed gloatingly. In the end, they were also fiercely scolded. Dake, who was also driven out of the library, smiled bitterly. But when there was an avalanche, not a single snowflake was innocent. Just now he was also whispering in the reading room and contributed to the destruction of the environment. Clack, clack, clack. Dake waved at Deanna and Luosi. Let's go back to the common room. We can be more relaxed in a different place. It was indeed a bit restrictive to have to suppress one's voice when teaching in the library. It was better to do it in the common room. Deanna and Luosi nodded. The three of them left the library without any depression. They were the first to return to the common room of the aristocrat's house, and quickly occupied a good place. Then they continued with the lecture. Although it was a lecture, the content of Dake's and Lily's lectures were actually not much different. It was just that they were more detailed, and the language used was more straightforward, and also easier to understand. Moreover, the 1-to-2 tutoring was more targeted. Combined with the test papers given by Lily, it was easier to integrate memory and application, and it was easier to grasp. Under Dake's patient guidance, even Deanna gradually grasped the basics, and was able to solve the questions by herself. Looking at her working hard, Dake couldn't help but reveal a gratified smile. Teaching and educating people was actually a very fulfilling thing. It was also good as a supplement for campus life. But when he was about to get up, he suddenly saw pairs of small eyes filled with thirst for knowledge. The first-year students of the aristocratic academy looked at him anxiously, like little lambs waiting to be fed. Therefore, in the common room of the aristocrat's house that night, there was a scene that hadn't been seen for many years in the Shungmalian house. Almost all of the first-year students of the aristocrat's house sat together and listened attentively to Teacher Diming's second lecture. The upperclassmen came and went, and they all looked at the group of first-year students with strange expressions. In particular, the golden-haired young man standing in the middle gave them a special feeling. A few upperclassmen couldn't help but listen to the lecture. They suddenly realized that the equations and unknowns taught by Dake were things that they had never heard of before. Therefore, behind the first-year students, there were a few upperclassmen auditing the lecture. Dake didn't finish his lecture until 10 o'clock in the evening. He sipped the apple juice that the little devil brought over and clapped his hands. Then, today's lecture will end here. If there's anything you don't understand, verify with each other and try to think on your own. When it comes to arithmetic, the main thing is that you can't be afraid. If you can maintain a normal attitude when learning, they will be at your mercy. The first-year students of the aristocrat's house nodded their heads in satisfaction. Some of them even wrote down his words and used them as a motto. The favorability between people would always increase through giving and receiving. If Dark also had a forbidden love, he would definitely be able to see their favorability towards him increase by a large margin. The benefits of these changes couldn't be seen now, but as time passed, it would gradually ferment and change things. After he did his best, he returned to the dormitory and checked the homework of the magic guiding fairies. Then he washed up and went to sleep. This day was so fulfilling that it was terrifying. The next day, Friday, the first class in the morning was a duel class, and the second class was a study of magical beasts. During the duel class, Professor Cheongsi once again reiterated this week's homework. She required the 7 students who joined the duel club to apply to participate in the newcomers competition on Saturday morning. They had to participate in at least one match and write a small paper analyzing it. The rest of the students had to choose one of the contestants and write a small paper analyzing the duel from the perspective of the audience. But in fact, there was no need for her to reiterate. This year's first-year students were more enthusiastic than she had imagined. They had long been looking forward to the duel. The second class was a study of magical beasts. Professor Nini actually caught another soul-sucking monster. When she took out the familiar jar from her small bag, the faces of the students who had luckily escaped from the previous class immediately turned green. But Professor Nini was still a little proud. Everyone completed the homework left last week very well. In order to make up for last week's missed opportunity, I specially went to the dungeon to catch another soul-sucking monster. This one is a little bigger, so it will definitely last a little longer. Then, without waiting for the students to clap and celebrate, she opened the lid of the jar and stuck 2 fingers in, picking up a living soul-sucking monster. After this soul-sucking monster came out, it took a deep breath and its body suddenly swelled to 2 meters tall. Its ghost-like body was emitting gray smoke, and the 3 black holes on its distorted face were dark and deep. Compared to the previous meter-tall soul-sucking monster, it was far more than just a little bigger. Woo! The soul-sucking monster revealed its ferocious appearance, baring its fangs and brandishing its claws, and howling like a ghost. Chapter 265. Soul Eaters were greedy and despicable. They would suck away all the happy memories and inject the horrible memories in the form of nightmares, making people die of despair in their sleep. Professor Nini's topic was to let the students experience the confusion and disappointment of having their memories sucked away by the Soul Eaters in advance, so that they could come back to their senses as soon as possible. The Soul Eaters were defenseless when they were sucking away the memories. They were as fragile as paper and could be easily killed. Therefore, no matter how ferocious they looked, as long as the mind was steady, there was no need to be afraid. However, knowing was one thing, and being able to do it was another. Most students were extremely repulsed by this experience. However, this was a necessary experience before entering the dungeon. It was a mandatory requirement in the World of Warcraft class. Professor Nini glanced around the classroom, and her eyes finally stopped on Luoboat's face. She said happily, "I remember you, Luoboat Broheim. You said last class that you wanted to experience it." Classic rumor. Luoboat immediately shook his head and denied. But the single-threaded Nini did not notice this. She shouted as loudly as she could. "Then let Broheim experience it first. Remember the website, VIP, can't you?" Six White nudged Luoboat's arm and encouraged him. "Go ahead, Luoboat. There's nothing to be afraid of." Luoboat was shocked. "That's not what you said last week." White smiled shyly. "Really? Maybe I'm not used to it yet. With Professor Nini here, there won't be any problems." Luoboat. "But this one is bigger than yours." White, "It's just bigger in size. It's like being tall, short, fat, and thin. The fatter you are, the more powerful you are." Luoboat. Under the gaze of the surrounding people, Luoboat finally braced himself and walked up to the podium. This World of Warcraft class had a good start. Professor Nini actually had a good impression of this boy who knew the origin of Warcraft. She grabbed the Soul Eater's tail and swung it upside down. Then she wrapped her other hand around its tail and stroked it from the tail to the tip of its mouth. The soul-sucking monster, which had been swollen to a frightening extent, was instantly flattened into a cylinder. Although it quickly bulged up again, its funny appearance was already deeply ingrained in people's hearts, making them not so scared anymore. Luoboat walked in front of the Soul Eater, swallowed his saliva, and said, "Let's begin." Professor Nini shook the Spirit Eater, and only grabbed the tip of its tail. The Soul Eater immediately pounced on Luoboat, baring its fangs and brandishing its claws. Luoboat stared hard into its eye sockets. Suddenly, its expression froze and it froze in place. Immediately after, a gray bubble slowly floated from his face. The bubble grew bigger and bigger. Luoboat's face gradually turned pale. "Ah!" He suddenly screamed, and a trace of blood flashed in his eyes. A trace of bloody aura leaked out. The Soul Eater's movements suddenly stopped. Professor Nini looked over in confusion and raised her hand to scratch her head. Luoboat came back to his senses from the soul-sucking monster's absorption and suddenly punched out. Puff! The Soul Eater's already bulging stomach was instantly flattened. The memory bubble that it had absorbed was vomited out, and it once again burrowed into Luoboat's mind. Luoboat came back to his senses, and some unfamiliar memories flowed through his mind. He didn't know what was going on, and was stunned in place. Luoboat Broheim very good. But Professor Nini was already clapping happily. Some of the students in the classroom had a whole new level of respect for him. Luoboat didn't really come back to his senses until he returned to his seat. He sat in his seat in a daze until White poked his arm and laughed. "You're really something, Luoboat." Luoboat came back to his senses and replied, "I'm just SOSO." In any case, Luoboat's performance did play a role in leading the way. Especially the students of the Night Institute, they all felt that they couldn't be weaker than Luoboat, so they all gathered their courage and walked up to the podium. The screams of people and the howls of the Soul Eater rose and fell one after another. The occasional mockery made the atmosphere even more lively. As for those who weren't very interested, such as Dake Dimung, they quietly did their own things. In the blink of an eye, the class came to an end. Professor Nini counted the names on the roster, and seeing that her teaching mission was gradually coming to an end, she was very excited. Only one more person left. She raised her head and looked at the blonde boy at the back of the classroom. This boy had helped her a lot during her first class last week, and she had always been grateful to him. Dake Dimung. Yes. Dake raised his head in response, and noticed that there was no student on the podium. "It's still my turn?" He put down his pen and stood up. In fact, he was quite curious about the Soul Eater's ability. Although it was recorded in the books that the Soul Eater only absorbed memories, the memory itself could be said to be an emotional trigger. People could feel happiness, anger, sorrow, and joy from memories, and their emotions would change according to the memories. In the development of the Big Sin series of magic cards, emotions, memories, and so on were all elements that could be linked. Only by mastering as much relevant knowledge as possible could one have a good foundation, break through the bottleneck, and develop one's own alchemy array. Half a minute later, Dake walked up to the podium. The poor Soul Eater was being grabbed by the tail by Professor Nini, floating around like a balloon. Although its face was still terrifying, now that he had looked at it for a long time, it was a little funny. Seeing that another human child was approaching, the Soul Eater's brain, which was as big as a grain of rice, immediately urged it to pounce on the child. If I were on Earth, I would be so scared that my legs would be weak. Dake blinked, and unexpectedly found that he wasn't scared at all. The Soul Eater's face quickly enlarged in his eyes, but it suddenly stopped when it was about to touch him. Professor Nini firmly grabbed its tail, as if she was grabbing a dog leash, so that it couldn't touch the student no matter what. They were very close to each other. Wisps of black gas overflowed from the 3 holes on the Soul Eater's face, emitting a faint rotten smell. Dake looked calm and stood with his hands by his side. Come suck me. Oh. The Soul Eater suddenly opened its mouth and inhaled. The black hole in its eyes and mouth rotated inwards, and the suction suddenly erupted. Dake narrowed his eyes slightly and felt his bangs and hair being sucked up. But other than that, there was nothing. Didn't you say that there would be memories being sucked out? He opened his eyes and looked up in confusion, meeting the Soul Eater's big eyes. Why don't you suck? I'm sucking. Can you hurry up? I'm really sucking. The Soul Eater felt humiliated. The Soul Eater sucked desperately. The Soul Eater sucked desperately. The Soul Eater was suffocated into a ball. The Soul Eater's suction was raised to the limit. Amidst the Soul Eater's angry roar, a little transparent tentacle finally floated out from Dake's face. The reason why it was so difficult was not because of other reasons, but only because his spiritual power had been strengthened after practicing the underworld god art. Skills such as the Soul Eater's Soul Eater were related to the strength of the spiritual power. The stronger the spiritual power of the other party, the harder it was to absorb. No matter what, the Soul Eater had finally succeeded after unremitting efforts. It looked at the tentacles floating out from Dake's face, and its eyes were filled with tears. But then, it was just a lick. The Soul Eater's body instantly froze, and then its swollen ball-like body suddenly twitched. Its small brain couldn't understand what had happened at all, and the ecology of its body was completely chaotic in this very short period of time. Its face was facing upwards, and a large number of filament-like tentacles were surging out of its eye sockets and mouth, spreading upwards continuously. There seemed to be something pushing out from within his body, causing the surface of his body to be uneven. What's going on? What happened? Is it going to explode again? The abnormality of the Soul Eater instantly caused the students to cry out in alarm. There was a sudden commotion in the classroom. The people sitting in the front row even hurriedly picked up books and other things to cover their faces, as if they could block the wind of the explosion by doing so. Ow, ow, ow. The Soul Eater's howl was miserable and helpless. Professor Nini looked at it with a confused face, then stretched out her finger and flicked it twice on its belly. But of course she couldn't see anything. Dake looked at the changes of the Soul Eater in surprise, and for a moment, he couldn't understand what had happened. But as the Soul Eater's body swelled like a balloon, everyone guessed its end. It was going to explode again. Professor Nini suddenly panicked, hurriedly grabbed the Soul Eater and ran out. Fortunately, the last explosion only blew out a gust of wind, but this explosion looked even more strange. She didn't want to be fired because of a teaching accident. This was a rare opportunity. Bang, bang, bang. Professor Nini quickly squeezed through the front door of the classroom. The curious students stood up instinctively. But not long after, a loud noise came from outside the classroom. Boom. The loud explosion reverberated in the spacious corridor. Dake, who was worried about Professor Nini, dashed out, but the huge and petite body stood still not far away. It turned around. Other than the hair around its face being a little messy, there was nothing wrong with it. It was indeed a behemoth mixed blood. It looks like last week. The Soul Eater couldn't withstand the pressure and exploded in anger. Professor Nini, who returned to the classroom, scratched her head and tried to look cute. "Professor, do more safety measures next time." AI Ma, who was sitting in the front row, said worriedly. Hey. Professor Nini's eyes flickered as she changed the topic. "Anyway, the lesson is ending soon. Today's homework is to choose a type of commonly seen magical creature for analysis and submit it before next Wednesday afternoon. I'll choose a type of magical creature for next week's lesson. So it's best for everyone to choose a magical creature that you like. Take note that it has to be a commonly seen magical creature. And it's not good if it's too powerful." The students looked at each other and realized that this was an opportunity. The commonly seen magical creatures in the underground city were not as ferocious and scary as the Soul Eater. Although there were very few of them, there were a few types that were cute, beautiful, and harmless. For example, Mushroom Bear. Deanna suddenly shouted. Luosi quickly pulled her down. Dake, who was sitting at the back, couldn't help but laugh. The Mushroom Bear was a bear cub with a mushroom on its head. If one only looked at the picture book, it was as cute as a ragdoll bear. But in fact, the Mushroom Bear could release very troublesome mushroom spores. It was a very dangerous magical creature in the underground city. But boys and girls at this age tended to only look at appearance. Girls liked cute magical creatures, while boys were more inclined towards handsome magical creatures. Someone like Doran, who was still yelling about dragons, and so on. If Professor Nini heard it, she would probably cry. Ring, ring, ring. The bell for the end of class rang. Dake put away the books and called Deanna and Luosi to leave the classroom. Friday afternoon was the opening time of Traveler Street, but they needed to go to the Duel Club to apply for the newcomers competition tomorrow morning. This didn't mean much to Dake. After all, he had a surplus of credits. But for the other 6 people, it was a good opportunity to earn credits. If they attended classes normally, each class was guaranteed to earn at least 10 credits. This semester, there were 14 classes in a week, so they could earn 140 credits. And if they participated in the newcomers competition, the registration fee was 50% off, only requiring 50 credits. If they won, they would earn 150 credits, which was equivalent to a week of classes. The only problem was that it was more difficult to win. After all, the newcomers competition was basically for the second-year students. So it was best to act according to their ability. After lunch, the 3 of them followed the map on the school card and found the Duel Club's office classroom on the top floor of the castle. The Duel Club's office classroom had 5 windows, corresponding to the second year to the 6th year. And the first-year students were naturally included in the second year. Basically, if they wanted to participate in the duel competition, they needed to come here and apply. But sometimes the Duel Club would take the initiative to send out invitations, usually with extra rewards. This afternoon, the worker at window 1 was a young lady who looked like a part-time student. Dake waited in line for about 10 minutes before it was finally his turn. He reported his name, filled out a simple form, paid 50 credits and received a contestant card. Only those who held the contestant card could enter the duel hall's internal contestant passage. The short-haired lady handed the contestant card to him and softly said, "The newcomers competition will be held on Saturday from 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. Before 12 p.m. tonight, the club will send a notice of the duel through your school card. At that time, you will be able to see your duel competition and your opponent." Dake was puzzled. "Do I have to wait that long?" The lady nodded. After the registration, the club will arrange the duel schedule according to the contestants, so it will be a bit late. Dake took the contestant card and looked at it, accepting this explanation. When he turned to leave, one of the members in the office classroom suddenly turned to look at him, his gaze hidden. 2 and 1 4,000 words, requesting monthly votes. Chapter 266. Zach Wilson. Aristocratic Academy, 4th grade, member of the Duel Club. At the same time, he was also a member of the Aristocratic History Research Society. The Wilson family was in the middle of the kingdom's aristocrats. Zach Wilson's father was a viscount with no real power, and was currently in the faction of the eldest prince. In fact, most of the members of the Aristocratic History Research Society were inclined towards the eldest prince. Even if their fathers were probably not in the faction of the eldest prince, their subjective will was mostly inclined towards the eagle faction. In fact, this had little to do with whether they were in favor of war or not. Those old aristocrats simply did not think that the eldest princess was qualified to inherit the throne. A traditional male heir, and a deviant female heir. They chose tradition in this multiple-choice question. As for why they did not stand up to support the eldest prince, it was naturally because the situation was not clear enough. Judging the situation, interests first. The ancient aristocrats who could survive until now were not simple people. If the eldest princess's faction showed that they could suppress the eldest prince's faction, they would support the eldest princess without hesitation, even if they had to suppress their disgust and feign civility. Remember, https://m, VIP can't you? VIP. It was just that the small aristocrats in the Aristocratic History Research Society were still young, and were not so shrewd. They did not hide their inner thoughts. Therefore, as the only son of the Dove faction's leader, the Valkyrie Dake's position was actually the opposite of most of the members of the Aristocratic History Research Society. But the position was one thing, and the inner thoughts were another. Dake originally gave people the impression that he was a typical aristocrat, and it was easy for those small aristocrats to classify him as the same kind of person. Even if he was not, he could be recruited into the society and then through subtle influence, change his thoughts and make things difficult for the Valkyrie. The Aristocratic History Research Society did not have good intentions from the beginning. After Dake left the office classroom with Deanna and Luo C., Zach Wilson whispered something to the people at the next table, and then quickly left. The Aristocratic History Research Society had a small gathering this afternoon, and the gathering place was in the society classroom. Zach Wilson soon arrived at the Aristocratic History Research Society's classroom. He pushed the door open and entered. One of them glared at him fiercely. He quickly closed the door and walked past the wall with his head lowered. The interior of the club's classroom was extravagant. The only thing that resembled the Aristocratic History Research Club was the two bookshelves against the wall. The bookshelves were neatly stacked with documents and materials related to the history of the aristocrats. It was more decorative than practical. At the round table in the innermost part of the classroom, Mike Owen, a third-year student, was talking softly with the president of the Aristocratic History Research Society. His tone was full of flattery. The sunlight that slanted through the window sprinkled on the table like a thin layer of golden gauze. The president of the Aristocratic History Research Society was the short man who had appeared in the Duel Club's recruitment contest. His name was Angus Jeffrey. The genealogy of the Jeffrey family was very ancient. It was said that they were a meritorious family that had existed since the founding of the kingdom. Their father, Count Jeffrey, was one of the 36 senators of the kingdom and held a high position. Angus Jeffrey had always claimed that he was the son of a senator and was very proud of it. Jeffrey had a head of golden hair that symbolized nobility. The ends of his hair fell to his shoulders. His bangs were neat, his nose was high, and his lips were slightly plump. He could be considered handsome. However, his shoulders were very wide and he was not very tall. His whole body did not seem to be very coordinated. Zach Wilson lowered his head and walked around the wall. He carefully whispered something into Jeffrey's ear. Jeffrey frowned and then relaxed. He chuckled and said, "He signed up for the competition in the second week? Owen, what do you think we should do to get him to join the club?" Owen raised his head and revealed a bright smile. "Let's pressure him a little. Let him know that he is nothing by himself. He will naturally look for a group, and we are the best choice." Jeffrey nodded and said, "That makes sense. Did you see what he was doing in the public restroom last night?" Owen sneered and said, "I heard that he was tutoring in arithmetic. It seems that the quality of this year's freshmen is not that high. They even need tutoring in arithmetic." Jeffrey said, "Tutoring in arithmetic? Helping others in their studies, establishing prestige and forming a rule. As expected of the son of a duke. He might be more difficult to deal with than we thought." Owen said, "Are you saying that he will establish a new club and have all the first-year students under his control?" Jeffrey said, "That's a possibility." Owen asked, Then what should we do? Jeffrey smiled and raised his hand. He put his fingers together and chopped down hard. Just like you said, pressure him a little. He then looked at Zach Wilson, who had been standing next to him, and asked, "How about it? Can you arrange it?" Wilson's forehead was covered in sweat. He said humbly, "As long as he is strong enough, it will be easy to manipulate." Jeffrey nodded. "Then let Kevin sign up." Elsie Kevin, a top second-year student in the House of Nobles, had just joined the Nobles History Research Club in the second half of last year. With the resources of the Nobles History Research Club, Kevin's strength had grown extremely quickly, and he was far from a first-year student who could defeat him. Dake did not expect that he would be targeted just by signing up. After leaving the duel club, he went to the library with Deanna and Luosi to finish this week's homework as soon as possible. His schedule was tight this week. In addition to the newcomer competition on Saturday morning, he also needed to spend time buying the materials for the killing skill card. It was 5 o'clock in the afternoon. After finishing his homework, Dake read for a while. Then he said goodbye to Deanna and Luosi and slipped away with his backpack. When he registered at the counter, he and Panduola looked at each other. Since there were people around, they did not say anything. Then he quickly returned to the dormitory, changed into his outdoor clothes, and went out again. The quiet lake reflected the afterglow of the setting sun. People came and went in the pavilion in the middle of the lake that led to Travelers Street. Panduola, wearing a woolen coat, stood quietly by the pavilion, looking up at the edge of the lake. When the students came and went, they could not help but look at her. However, the cold atmosphere made people not dare to approach her. Dake walked through the long covered bridge and finally saw her back. He could not help but walk over. "Senior, what are you looking at?" "Fish." Panduola gently touched her hair and said softly. Dake poked his head out and asked doubtfully, "You can see that?" Panduola laughed. "Can't you just pretend that you can see it?" Dake blinked. "Then let's have an all-fish feast today." Panduola, "Really, let's go." The two of them turned and walked to one of the stone tables. They sat down on the stone stool beside the table. Then their bodies turned and suddenly disappeared. The same pavilion in the middle of the lake, the same stone stool. The two of them appeared at the same time. Dake stood up and rubbed his hands. "It's a little cold. The temperature has dropped a little recently. I feel like it's going to snow. Has it ever snowed in the castle?" Panduola, "When I was here, it snowed twice. The whole world was white. I didn't like it." Dake, "Is that so?" After that he did not mention it again. Although he actually liked snow. Dake had not deliberately shopped around the restaurants in Travelers Street, but after walking around a lot, he knew which restaurants were better, and which were more stylish. The Waltz restaurant was a better choice, but the atmosphere there was too strong. Now that it was Friday night, there were even more couples there. He could tell that Chun Yushan didn't like crowded places. So he walked a little deeper and found a high-end restaurant with 3 floors. This restaurant, called Le Mi, was beautifully decorated and of high quality. In other words, it was more expensive. Junior students who were short on credits usually wouldn't come here to spend money. But that was not the point. The point was that there really was an all-fish feast here. Grilled fish, boiled fish, fish rice, fish slices, caviar. When plates of exquisite fish dishes were brought to the table by the waiter, Dake could not help but feel hungry. Panduola also seemed to be in a good mood. It was just that the plates of fish dishes were only the size of a palm. So although it was delicious, there was too little of it. Dake ate a little of each dish and then stopped. He tilted his head and watched as Senior continued to eat. After the table was finished, she obviously wanted more and said regretfully, "As expected, your meat is more to my taste." Dake smiled and said, "Then I'll make it again next time." Panduola shook her head and smiled. "I can't trouble you anymore. How is it? Are you busy with your studies?" Dake nodded. "I'm a little busy, but it's always good to be able to learn and see my progress." Panduola, "I heard that you're participating in the newcomers competition tomorrow?" Dake, "Yes, the professor asked." Panduola, "What time?" "I'll go cheer you on." Dake, "They haven't informed me yet." Panduola, Okay, then let's walk around the night market for a while. I haven't walked around at night in a long time. Dake, okay. The deeper the night, the lower the temperature. However, the temperature between people did not drop because of this. Even though the two of them were not the type to talk big, they still chatted a lot on the road and gradually got to know each other better. They were not as passionate as the other couples on the road, nor did they have any intimate contact. However, the atmosphere between the two of them was just right. Panduola was a changeable person. At first glance, she seemed very quiet, but when they first met, they thought that she was very outgoing. However, after interacting with her for a while, they realized that she was actually very introverted. Dake even realized that she was very insecure. This was something that could not be seen from her appearance. 9:30 p.m., the sky was clear and the moon was bright. Dake felt his school card vibrate. After a while, he took it out. As expected, the notice for the duel had arrived. Is it here? Panduola leaned over, and the night wind brought with it a hint of cold fragrance. Dake injected a trace of magic power into the card and opened the notice file. He then read it carefully. The 10th round, estimated time is 9:30 p.m. The opponent is Elsie Kevin of the 2nd grade of the noble house. Panduola frowned slightly. Elsie Kevin? I seem to have heard this name somewhere. Dake smiled. It seems that he's a good opponent to have left an impression on senior sister. Panduola said. That's your first battle. Don't lose. Dake said. There's no guarantee of victory in a duel. Besides, if a person can't even experience failure in their life, wouldn't they be very incomplete? Looking at his serious appearance, Panduola couldn't help but chuckle. How can you find excuses for yourself when you haven't even lost yet? Huh, Dake said in surprise. I'm speaking from the bottom of my heart. Panduola said. Okay then. I wish you a great victory tomorrow. Dake said, look forward to it. Now that the notice had been given, the two of them had no reason to continue shopping. They chose a path and walked back unhurriedly. At 10 o'clock, they finally returned to the castle. Dake walked Panduola to the tower of the Magic Academy and returned alone. When he returned to his dorm, he was accompanied by the magic elves again. What was there to complain about in life? That night, Dake had a good dream. In the blink of an eye, it was Saturday. Because it was the first time that he would have a duel in an outdoor arena, he was actually quite cautious. He put on his school uniform, put on the badge of the duel club, combed his hair, and spun around in front of the mirror. He felt pretty good. Dake took out his magic card and stored the magic elves into it one by one before putting them in his card bag. He didn't forget to bring the player card in the end, and left just like that. This morning he had an appointment with Deanna and Luosi to have breakfast in the cafeteria, so he didn't need to bother the little devil beasts. Deanna appeared in the corridor. Her long silver hair was pulled into a one-sided ponytail and tied up with a cute panda hairband. Her face was flushed red, and she looked a little excited. For the 7 first-year students, today's newcomer competition was the real first battle. It was very memorable. Girls were meticulous and sensitive, and they valued ceremonies more. On the other side, Luosi was holding a paper sign made of cardboard. There was a silly big-headed bear cub and a golden ahog cat drawn on it. In the middle was a red heart with a big, "Do your best" written on it. How is it? Does it look good? Luosi raised the sign and waved it in front of Dake, her face full of expectation. Although Dake really wanted to ask her why his symbol was a cat, according to the etiquette of the nobles, he should give the lady who had put in a lot of effort a proper compliment. So he squeezed out a sentence. It's really not bad. Deanna smiled slyly at the side. It was rare for the first-year students to wake up so early on a Saturday. Their classmates could be seen everywhere in the cafeteria. Each of the 7 duelists had their own fans. Among them, Saraswati from the School of Magic, Justin Wayne from the School of Knights, and Teddy Dolan from the School of Nobles had more fans because of their personalities and other factors. For people like Dake and Ai Ma, because they always drifted away from the social circle, they only had their own small circles. But some people on the surface didn't have many fans, but when they really climbed to the top, they had a lot of support. There were also some people who really didn't have many fans. Around 7:30, the first-year students set off from the cafeteria and walked one after another to the open-air dueling arena. The atmosphere was just right. 2 and 1 4,000. Chapter 267. The Shungmalian open-air dueling hall was generally structured like the Colosseum in Rome. But under the magnificent appearance, there was a mystery. The huge auditorium that could accommodate tens of thousands of people did not actually exist in the academy, but was distributed throughout the kingdom through a special mechanism. In an era where entertainment was lacking, dueling competitions were extremely popular, and a variety of new industries were derived from them. Although the Shungmalian dueling competition was not the most authoritative, it was the most popular. Every weekend, tens of thousands of spectators would enter the auditorium from all over the country, and then through the special projection transmission mechanism, they would watch the wonderful duels of the students. At this time, carriages after carriages stopped at the Shungmalian dueling hall in the capital of the kingdom. After a busy week, going to the dueling hall to watch a wonderful duel was a reward for oneself. But the atmosphere today seemed a little different. As soon as John Sr. walked out of the corner, he could not help but stop. He was 46 years old this year, and was still single, but it was good to be able to survive in this era. Website. https://m. Vipcanchu. VIPN. He had recently found a way to make a fortune. If he could make a fortune with this, maybe he could really get rid of being single? He glanced at the hall entrance. The rise of the competitive industry was always accompanied by all kinds of spinach. But he was not involved in spinach. He was just a small bookseller, a small book that recorded the information of the players. Every year at this time, there would be new people joining, so he would come on time to collect information in order to draw a new book. But today's atmosphere, John could not help but shrink back to the corner, his heart frightened. The family emblems on those carriages were too scary. Not only were there the family emblems of great aristocrats, but there was also the royal family's emblem. Oh my God, what's going on? John Sr. was so scared that his legs went soft. Is there a member of the royal family among today's newcomers? He shivered twice and quickly retreated. He could not watch anymore. If he was noticed by the royal guards, he would not be able to explain himself. He decided to wait for half an hour before entering the hall. Inside one of the royal carriages, Sage of Beasts, Claire Kate was squinting her eyes as she stroked the back of the fat cat named Galileo. She seemed to be recalling a certain feeling. Beside her, Valkyrie, Yvette St. Dimming was having an intimate conversation with First Princess Elisha. Ever since the First Princess attended the Shungmalian Halloween party, Yvette often chatted with her. Later, when Claire returned, she pestered Claire again. She was always worried that her son would be bullied in the academy. She didn't know if he ate well or wore warm clothes. Would she be lonely without her mother by her side? Even though Elisha and Claire told her that she didn't need to worry, she was still worried. I haven't seen my baby for almost half a year. I wonder if she has lost weight. Arvette looked into the distance, full of worry. The First Princess Elisha comforted him. Duke, you will be able to see it soon. Arvette asked. But can my baby really pass the Duel Club's assessment in his first year? Elisha's tone was helpless. He is the winner of the Crimson Star. Arvette asked, really? Elisha couldn't help but lean back in her chair and look up at the sky. How did such a smart person become like this? A few minutes later, they walked down from the carriage. Almost at the same time, First Prince Charles also walked down from another royal carriage. Beside him was the Archbishop of the Holy Church, a haggard old man. The two sides looked at each other from afar. The first prince snorted and entered the arena from the other side with the Archbishop. They were here to see the hero. Shungmalian. Dake followed the crowd into the open-air arena and observed the facilities with great interest. This was his first time here. The arena of the open-air arena was obviously larger than the indoor arena. Every arena was at least 120 by 80. The size of the arena would inevitably lead to changes in tactics. In short, the rhythm on the surface would slow down, but the internal confrontation would only intensify. He turned his head and looked at the audience. It wasn't 8 yet, so the connection between the audience and the arena wasn't opened. At this time, there was no one in the audience, so the entire arena seemed quite deserted. If the students wanted to watch the battle, they could only watch from a special seat inside. It was a circular belt between the audience seats and the duel arena. It would not be projected to the various branches of the kingdom along with the duel arena. Then I'll go first. Luosi waved the bear and cat sign and walked towards the ring. Dake and Deanna showed their contestant cards to the staff and then entered the contestant passage. What's your round? Dake asked. Deanna waved her school card and squinted. Round 4. Dake asked. If it's 10 minutes per round, then it's 8:30. Do you have a chance of winning? Deanna thought for a bit. A little, but only a little. Dake smiled. Then we'll do our best. Deanna said worriedly. But what if we can't win even if we try our best? Dake said. Then we'll win it back next time. Deanna said. That's true. She then smiled. Soon, the ring was full of people. Not only were the first-year students all here, but there were also a lot of high school students and some professors. Although the freshmen's competition couldn't be compared to the competition, the freshmen's vitality added a lot of color to the duel. Professor Cheongsi and Professor Fox sat side by side. This time they didn't fight. Next to them, Professor Shi Erfu and Professor Lili were also there. However, one of them was there to observe as the vice principal, while the other was there to have fun. A little further away, Professor Ryan Harks and Professor Mitya Bartholomew were also there. At 8 o'clock sharp, there was a space distortion in the auditorium. Then the audience members appeared in the auditorium one by one. They weren't really there, they were just projections. Dark, who was in the contestants' lounge, looked through the window at the ring-shaped belt, trying to find Senior Pandora's figure. Then he unexpectedly saw Yvette in the audience. Yvette was sitting in the front row. On her left was the princess, and on her right was Claire. Her soft blonde hair was very eye-catching. If she just sat there, she would be a model of gentleness and elegance. However, Yvette's face was full of worry. It was probably because the clock had already rung at 8 o'clock, but she still didn't see her precious son. Dake couldn't help but hesitate. Why are they here? I'm stuck. Make up for it before 6 o'clock. You're tuning in to the Earbook Haven YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.